Hey friends, welcome back. Or if this is your first time here, welcome in. Pull the blanket a little closer. Let the room get quiet and just breathe. Tonight, we're going somewhere you've never been before. Not a country, not a city. We're going back in time to the very moment a human being in the Middle Ages closed their eyes and tried to sleep. Now, before we begin, and I mean this because I genuinely love that you are here, if something tonight makes you think or makes you feel or makes you quietly reach for your pillow with a new kind of gratitude, please take a second before you drift off and hit that like button. Maybe share this with someone who also loves falling asleep to history. And if you feel like leaving a little note in the comments, tell me where you are right now, what time it is, what you're lying on. I would love to picture you there. Your words mean more than you know. And with that, let us dim the lights all the way down. Turn on the fan if you have one. Let that soft hum fill the room and let tonight's story begin. Here is something I want you to think about for a moment. Right now, at this very second, you are lying on something. Maybe a mattress with foam layers engineered by people with science degrees. Maybe a pillow that was designed to align your spine at exactly the right angle. Maybe you're under a blanket that is temperature regulating, moisture wicking, and probably marketed to you at 3 o'clock in the morning by an algorithm that knows you too well. And here's the wild thing. After all of that, after the melatonin and gummies, the sleep trackers, the blackout curtains, the white noise machine, 1 in 3 Americans still cannot sleep properly. 1 in 3. Meanwhile, about 800 years ago, a peasant farmer in rural England was wrapping himself in a single wool cloak, lying down on a pile of straw on a dirt floor with a pig somewhere nearby, beetles in the thatch above his head, and the wind coming through the walls. And he slept just fine. Well, maybe not fine, but he slept. And tonight we're going to find out exactly what that looked like. Because I promise you it was stranger, more fascinating, and more deeply human than anything you have been told. Let us start at the very beginning. What even was sleep in the Middle Ages? And I do not mean that as a philosophical question, though we will get there too. I mean it literally. How did people understand this thing that happened to them every single night? Today we think of sleep as a biological necessity, a process. Your body repairs itself. Your brain consolidates memory. Your cells regenerate. We know the science. We have cycles and sleep stages and charts with wave patterns. The medieval mind had absolutely none of that. To a peasant in the 14th century, sleep was something that just happened to you, like weather, like hunger, like death. Eventually, you did not manage your sleep. You did not optimize it. You did not schedule it between your evening workout and your morning journaling practice. You simply fell into it when the sun went down and the world went dark. Because when the light was gone, there was nothing else to do. And that is the first thing that separates their world from ours. Light. We forget, and I mean we really genuinely forget how completely and utterly dark the night used to be. No streetlights, no phone screens, no refrigerator hum, and the little glow of the clock on the microwave. Just darkness, real darkness, the kind that has weight to it. When the sun set in a medieval village, the world did not slow down gradually the way it does for us. It stopped abruptly, completely. And so most people went to bed shortly after sunset, somewhere around 8 or 9 o'clock, depending on the season. Not because they were tired necessarily, but because there was nothing else to see. Now, here is where it gets interesting. When we say went to bed, we need to be very careful about what we mean. Because the bed as we know it today was not what most people in the Middle Ages slept in. For the majority of people, farmers, laborers, craftsmen, the vast and ordinary population of medieval Europe, the bed was not a place. It was a material. And that material was straw. Straw or hay or moss or dried leaves, whatever was available from the land that season. These were gathered, piled together, maybe stuffed into a rough cloth sack and laid directly on the floor. That was your mattress. That was your bed. The Elizabethan writer William Harrison, looking back on earlier times, wrote that ordinary people once slept on straw pallets covered only with a sheet and used a good round log for a pillow. A log for a pillow. Now, I want you to imagine that for a second. Not just the discomfort of it, but the intimacy. Because in a one-room peasant cottage in medieval England, everyone slept together in that same space, the husband and wife, the children, sometimes the grandparents, and in many, many cases, the animals too. The pig might be just a few feet away, the goat tethered near the door, the chickens in a corner. This was not poverty in the way we understand it today. This was just life, normal, ordinary, unremarkable life for the overwhelming majority of human beings alive in that era. And in some ways, it was warmer for it. The animals generated heat. The bodies packed together generated heat. The fire at the center of the room, which someone had to get up and tend in the night or risk waking to frozen darkness. That fire was the beating heart of the household. Sleep was not a private act. Sleep was communal. Now, the moment you moved up even slightly in the world, the moment you had a little more land, a little more grain, a little more coin, the sleeping situation changed. And it changed dramatically. For the middle class of medieval society, merchants, minor, nobility, skilled craftsmen who had done well for themselves, the bed became something else entirely. It became a statement. It became, in fact, the most expensive piece of furniture you could possibly own. A proper medieval bed with a frame, a rope support system across the base, a mattress stuffed with wool or feathers linen sheets, a wool blanket. Perhaps a fur coverlet could cost more than a laborer earned in a year. And people were proud of them. Extraordinarily, almost absurdly proud. Beds were mentioned in wills. People left their beds to their children and their grandchildren the way we might leave jewelry today. There is a beautiful record from the year 1540, that is 1540, of a woman named Marjorie Wren, who left her son Geoffrey a red and green bed canopy in her will. He already had the bed itself. She just wanted to make sure he had the canopy because even in death the details mattered. And in the grandest houses, the homes of lords and barons, the great halls of England and France, and the German kingdoms, the bed was not even tucked away in a bedroom. It was displayed prominently in the main hall where guests would see it like a painting, like a trophy, like the clearest possible signal that you had arrived. But here is something that might genuinely surprise you. Even in those grand households, even among the wealthy, where the bed was an object of beauty and pride and generational inheritance, the act of sleeping was still profoundly communal. You did not sleep alone unless you were truly alone in life. Queen Elizabeth I had a magnificent bed, but her ladies-in-waiting slept on straw pallets on the floor of her chamber. Lords invited honored guests to share their beds not as a strange intrusion, but as an act of hospitality. To be invited into someone's bed was a gesture of trust, of warmth, of welcome, and in the inns and taverns along the roads of medieval Europe, perfect strangers shared beds without a second thought. You would arrive exhausted from the road, pay your coin, and the innkeeper would show you to a mattress which you would share with whoever had arrived before you. No apologies, no awkwardness, just two tired humans trying to stay warm. The concept of sleeping alone in your own space, in your own room. That is a very modern idea and a very lonely one when you think about it. Now we have to talk about the ropes because this is where one of the most familiar phrases in the English language actually comes from, and most people have no idea. The base of a proper medieval bed was not a solid platform. It was a network of ropes interlaced across the wooden frame, creating a kind of cradle for the mattress above. And these ropes over time would stretch. They would sag in the middle, creating an uncomfortable hammock effect, tilting the sleeper downward. So regularly, especially before an important night's rest, you would call the servant or do it yourself, and you would tighten the ropes, pull them taut, secure the knots, make the surface firm again, and then satisfied, you would climb in for the night, sleep tight. That is where it comes from. Sleep tight means sleep on tight ropes. I know you are never going to say that phrase the same way again. You are welcome. But there is one more layer to the medieval night that I have not told you about yet. And this one, I promise, is going to change something small but real inside the way you think about your own sleep. Because here is the secret that the Middle Ages kept. Here is the thing that historians only rediscovered in the past few decades. Medieval people did not sleep the way we sleep. They did not go to bed at 9 o'clock and wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and call that a night. They slept in two separate pieces. Historians call it the first sleep and the second sleep. You would fall asleep shortly after dark. You would sleep deeply, maybe 2 hours, maybe 3, and then naturally your body would wake you up. Not because something was wrong, not because a baby cried or a dog barked or the fire needed tending, though all of these things happened too, but because your body had finished its first sleep. And the night was not over. Between the first sleep and the second, there was a waking period, sometimes an hour, sometimes longer. And what did people do in that hour? They talked to each other there in the dark. They prayed. They thought about their dreams, which in medieval belief were not random noise from the brain, but messages, sometimes from God, sometimes from darker places worth sitting with and turning over carefully. Some people got up and did a little work by candlelight or moonlight. Some people, as the records rather cheerfully document, made love. And then when the wakefulness passed, they drifted back to sleep for the second sleep, resting until the morning light finally called them up. This was not insomnia. This was just how nights worked. The historian Roger Kirch of Virginia Tech spent years documenting this finding. Over 2,000 references to first sleep and second sleep across more than a dozen languages. The French called the first sleep the premier psalm. The Italians called it the primo sonno. It showed up in Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, in medical texts, in prayer books, in legal depositions. It was everywhere, and then slowly, as gas lamps lit the streets of European cities in the early 19th century. And Thomas Edison's light bulbs banished the darkness entirely, the second sleep faded away. People stayed up later, the gap between the two sleeps compressed. Eventually, it vanished. And with it, we lost something that humans had been doing since before written history. We lost that quiet hour in the middle of the night, that strange, calm, slightly altered space between one dream and the next. The sleep scientists who study this today say that the hormonal profile of that waking period was remarkable low cortisol elevated prolactin, a kind of natural calm that one researcher compared to a meditative state. And now we call waking up at 2 in the morning a problem. We lie there anxious, staring at the ceiling, wondering what is wrong with us when the answer perhaps is nothing. Perhaps we're just remembering something ancient, something our bodies never forgot, even when our minds moved on. So tonight, as you settle in, I want you to hold something gently. The people who slept on straw floors in smoky rooms with ropes beneath their mattresses and animals nearby, they did not sleep perfectly, not even close, but they slept honestly, without expectation of perfection, without the tyranny of an 8-hour block measured and evaluated and rated on a scale of 1 to 10 by a device on their wrist. They simply let the night take them, and then they woke quietly in the dark, and then they let it take them again. But sleep was only the beginning of the story because where you slept and what you slept on said everything about who you were in medieval society. The straw beneath your body was not just straw. It was a declaration of your place in the world, of your worth, of how much the world thought you deserved rest at all. And just ahead, we're going to step inside that world more closely into the beds of peasants and merchants and kings and discover how completely ruthlessly and sometimes heartbreakingly your place in medieval society was written in the very surface where you laid your head. So let us think about something together, just for a moment. If I asked you right now without looking, without thinking too hard to describe your bed, what would you say? Probably something like a frame, a mattress, a pillow or two, maybe a duvet. Comfortable, private, yours. Now, here's what I find quietly remarkable about that answer. Every single element of what you just described, the frame, the softness beneath you, the pillow under your head, the fact that it belongs only to you, every single one of those things was at one point in history a luxury so extreme that only a tiny fraction of humanity could afford it. And in the Middle Ages, where you slept and on what and with whom these things did not just reflect your wealth, they announced it to everyone loudly. Let me take you to the bottom first, because the truest understanding of any society starts not at the top but at the floor. And for the great majority of men and women living in medieval Europe, the farmers, the laborers, the servants, the countless ordinary people who made the world run, the floor was exactly where they slept. Not metaphorically, literally on the floor. A one-room peasant cottage in 14th century England was not large. A single open space may be 12 foot wide, maybe 15 shared by an entire family. The hearth burned in the center or along one wall. Smoke drifted up through a hole in the thatch roof, or it did not, and it simply filled the room instead. When night came, everyone found a spot. The sleeping surface, if you were lucky, was a rough cloth sack stuffed with whatever could be gathered from the land. Straw, hay, moss, dried grass, sometimes rags, sometimes a mix of all of them. And if you were not lucky, or more accurately, if you were simply poor in the way that most people were poor in that era, you pulled your cloak around, you found a softish patch of ground, and that was your bed. Historians note that these mattress fillings were changed at best once a year. Once a year. Think about that. Think about what a year of sleeping on the same straw means in terms of moisture. In terms of the life that inevitably moves into it, the fleas, the lice, the small crawling things that made their homes in the warmth of human sleep. People knew about them, they accepted them. They were simply part of the texture of nights. Even King Henry VIII, who had more resources than almost anyone on the planet, had his straw mattress changed every single day. Not because that was normal, because it was extraordinary, because daily changing was a royal privilege, not a basic expectation. For everyone else, you lived with what you had, and what you had lived with you. Now, one rung up from the floor, and it was a meaningful rung, make no mistake, were the servants who worked in larger households. Not the grand noble estates, not yet, just households with slightly more means. These servants slept on what were called truckle beds, small, low wooden frames on little wheels. During the day, they would be rolled away, tucked underneath the larger bed of the master, invisible, out of sight, taking up no space. At night, they would be wheeled out, and the servant would sleep on them right there on the floor of the bedchamber. Close enough to hear if they were needed, close enough to wake at a moment's call. There is something I find both practical and quietly devastating about the truckle bed. It solves a real problem. Where do you put a servant when you need them nearby but cannot give them a room? And yet the solution is to make their bed literally roll away and disappear beneath yours. To sleep in medieval service was to understand physically that your rest was subordinate to someone else's comfort. Even horizontally, there was a hierarchy. I want to pause here and ask you something because I think about this a lot. Have you ever slept in a place that made you feel without anyone saying a word exactly where you stood in the world? A cot in a hostel while someone else had a private room? A couch at a relative's house while the guest bedroom sat empty? There is something that the body registers about these arrangements, something older than language. Medieval people understood that feeling in ways we can barely imagine because for them it was not occasional. It was every night for their entire lives moving up the ladder. Now for the merchant class, the tradesman, the minor clergy who had accumulated some small portion of comfort, the bed became something else. It became a project. You saved for it. Sometimes for years, a proper bedstead, a wooden frame sturdy enough to hold the weight of rope support, stretched across the base, topped with a mattress of wool or coarse linen stuffed with whatever you could afford, was the single largest financial investment most middle-class households would ever make. Not the house, the bed. There are records from the 15th century inventories of modest English households where the bed is listed first among all possessions, where the bed commands more column space than the table, the chairs, the tools, the animals. One inventory from around the 1450s documents a small holder's possessions in meticulous detail, and he had listed with evident pride 3 boards for a bed, a sheet, pillows, worn coverlets, and canvas covers. 3 boards and a sheet, and yet it was recorded. It was worth recording because that man had risen in at least this one small way off the floor, and that mattered. Now there is something that the middle classes of the medieval world understood intuitively that we have almost entirely forgotten, and it has to do with what you put inside the mattress, because the mattress itself was not a single uniform object. It was a system at the bottom. You started with straw or hay firm, cheap, providing structure and a barrier from the cold. Over that went a second layer, sometimes wool, sometimes moss, softer, retaining heat better, and if you were doing particularly well, a third layer of feathers or down on top. The wealthiest households had feather beds, entire mattresses stuffed with down laid over a base mattress of straw, which itself rested on the rope frame, 3 layers deep before you even reach the sheets. And here's where I think something genuinely interesting lives. The fairy tale of the princess and the pea, that old story of a young woman who feels a tiny pea through layers and layers of mattresses. That story is not just whimsy, it is a cultural memory. It is a coded record of what wealth looked like at night. To feel something through many mattresses meant you were lying on many mattresses. To feel nothing, to be perfectly cushioned from the world below you was what aristocratic rest was supposed to feel like. The princess was being tested not on sensitivity, but on entitlement. Could she feel the discomfort that commoners simply lived with? If not, she was royal. If she could, she was probably just a person. But here's the thing about the great medieval beds, the ones belonging to lords and ladies, to bishops and barons, that I do not think we fully appreciate. They were not just furniture, they were architecture. By the 14th century, the grandest beds in England and France had evolved into extraordinary structures. Tall posts of carved oak or walnut rising several feet above the sleeping surface. Overhead, a canopy, a wooden or fabric ceiling suspended above the bed. Around the sides, heavy curtains that could be drawn completely closed. And over all of it, the family coat of arms embroidered in thread or painted onto the headboard or woven into the fabric of the hangings. When you lay down in one of these beds, you are not simply lying down. You were enclosed, surrounded by carved wood and embroidered heraldry contained within a small room within the room. The curtains were not decorative. They were practical, keeping in the warmth, keeping out the drafts that came through the stone walls of great houses, keeping out the insects, keeping out the smoke. But they were also theatrical. To draw the curtains of a great bed was to perform nightly the ritual of withdrawal, of dignity, of saying, "Here, behind these curtains, the world ends and I begin." And this is where medieval social life takes one of its most surprising turns. Because even in those great curtain beds, even in the bedchambers of the powerful people rarely slept alone the master of the house and his wife, yes, but on the floor around them, servants on their truck beds. In the outer chamber, more servants, perhaps guests of lower rank stretched on pallets, and in the great hall below the household, everyone who worked and lived under that roof, settled on benches and floors with their cloaks and blankets. The household slept like a map of itself, rank radiating outward from the great bed at the center, diminishing floor by floor, room by room, all the way to the stable door. And here's the remarkable thing about sharing. Among equals, among men of similar rank, similar status, similar standing, sharing a bed was not awkward. It was a gesture of friendship. When Henry II of England heard that his son, Richard the Lion he Heart, had shared both a dinner plate and a bed with Philip II, the young king of France, Henry was delighted. He saw it as a sign of peace between their kingdoms. A shared bed was a sign of trust, of alliance, of closeness. The intimacy of sleeping near someone, the vulnerability of it, the warmth of it meant something different. When privacy was not the default, it meant you were not enemies. It meant the night was safe. And now we come to the most spectacular piece of furniture in this whole story. Because somewhere along the long road, from straw on the floor to embroidered curtains overhead, one bed became so enormous, so famous, so thoroughly impractical and wonderful that it entered literature, was referenced on the stages of London, and ended up in a museum in the Victoria and Albert in London, where you can go and see it today. Around the year 1590, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, an innkeeper in the town of Ware, a small coaching stop about 22 miles north of London, had an idea. Ware was a convenient overnight stop for travelers heading north toward Cambridge and beyond. There were many inns. Competition was fierce, and so this particular innkeeper commissioned something extraordinary. A bed. But not just any bed. A bed 11 feet wide, 11 feet deep, nearly 9 feet high, carved from English oak, decorated with Renaissance motifs. Acanthur leaves satyrs, lions, human figures painted in vivid color on the headboard. A bed so enormous it was almost absurd. Almost. The Great Bed of Ware, as it came to be known, was designed as a tourist attraction, and it worked. Travelers went out their way to sleep in it, to say they had, to carve their initials into the wooden posts or press their signet rings into little blobs of red sealing wax on the headboard, marking their night in the famous bed. The earliest dates carved into the wood still visible today go back to 1653. In 1596, just a few years after the bed was made, a German prince named Ludwig of Anhalt-Cotton traveled through England and recorded his visit in a diary written in verse. He wrote at where was a bed of dimensions so wide 4 couples might cozily lie side by side, and thus, without touching each other, abide, 4 couples side by side not touching. And then there is the story almost certainly circulated by the innkeepers themselves as excellent marketing, that in 1689-26 butchers and their wives slept in the great bed on a dare. 26 people in one bed. I genuinely cannot decide if that is impressive or terrifying. And I think perhaps it is both. The bed became so famous that William Shakespeare himself mentioned it in Twelfth Night around 6001. Sir Toby Belch, looking for the largest possible comparison he can find, describes a sheet of paper as being big enough for the bed of Ware in England. That line landed because everyone in the audience knew exactly what he meant. The bed of Ware was the kind of famous that did not require explanation. It had passed into the common imagination of an entire era. What I find quietly beautiful about the Great Bed of Ware is what it reveals about the medieval relationship to sleep as a shared experience. We built a bed for 11 fine and invited strangers to fill it. We carved our names into the post not to claim ownership but to mark our presence, to say I was here. I lay down in this place. I rested under these carved lions and these painted figures and this enormous roof of oak. I too was weary once and I slept. There is one more thing I want to tell you about the class architecture of medieval sleep, and it has to do not with what you slept on but with how you were supposed to sleep, the angle of your body, the position of your limbs, because the medieval world had opinions about this too, strong ones. The physician Andrew Boor, writing in the mid-6th century, recommended sleeping first on the right side of the body, then turning to the left as the night progressed. The gentle slope this created between the head and the stomach was believed to aid digestion, to keep the body in proper humoral balance, to prevent illness. Sleeping flat on the back, he and other physicians warned, was genuinely dangerous. It was believed to flood the base of the brain with excessive moisture, to cause nightmares, to invite the visit of a demon known as the incubus, a creature that sat on your chest in the night and crushed the breath from you. And here is the detail that has lived in my mind since I first read it. Pillows. Soft padded pillows for the head were considered in medieval England to be unmanly, reserved for the old, the sick, the young girls, the pregnant. A real man rested his head on a log. And yet there was also this competing belief that you absolutely must sleep with your head slightly raised. Because if you slept with your mouth open and your head flat, the devil might slip inside. And so the medieval sleeper found himself in this very particular dilemma. Too soft. A pillow was shameful, too flat. A position was spiritually dangerous. Sleeping on your back invited demons. Sleeping on your front was probably also wrong somehow. And you thought your sleep hygiene was complicated. The truth is, every layer of medieval sleeping, from the straw on the earthen floor to the embroidered curtains of the great lord's chamber, tells the same story, just in different languages. Sleep was not neutral. Sleep was not simply rest. Sleep was where your place in the world became briefly physical, where your rank was made horizontal, where what you had accumulated and what you'd been born into became the surface beneath your body every single night of your life. And in that way, perhaps the medieval world was more honest than ours, because at least when they lay down, they knew exactly where they stood. But knowing your place in the world and sleeping peacefully within it, those were very different things, because the medieval night held something that no amount of feather mattress or embroidered canopy could entirely protect against. Something that crept into the grandest bedchambers and the humblest straw pallets alike. Something that made even kings reluctant to close their eyes without first saying a prayer. The night itself and the things that were believed to move through it. Just ahead, we'll go somewhere darker, stranger, and far more fascinating into the medieval imagination of what actually happened after the candles went out. And I promise you, it will make you feel very differently about the simple act of closing your eyes. Darkness does something to the human mind. You already know this. You have felt it. That particular quality of unease that arrives not with any specific threat, but simply with the absence of light. The way a familiar room becomes slightly strange after midnight. The way sounds seem louder, closer, more significant than they ever do in daylight. The way your brain, left without visual information to anchor itself, begins to manufacture meaning from shadows. You feel this in the 21st century with a phone in your hand and streetlights outside your window, and the soft digital glow of a dozen devices keeping perfect darkness at bay. Now imagine feeling it without any of that. Imagine a night so complete, so absolute, so total, that you cannot see your own hand in front of your face. That was every night for nearly every person alive in the Middle Ages. And the question that has always fascinated me is not what they did in that darkness. It is what they believed was in it with them. Let me tell you about the word nightmare. Not the modern word, the vague clinical term we use for a bad dream that wakes you sweating. The original word, the word mare, does not come from the horse. It comes from an Old English and Old Norse word, mara, referring to a spirit, a creature, something that came in the night and sat on your chest while you slept. In medieval belief, this was not metaphor, it was not symbolic. It was a physical entity, female usually, that descended on sleeping people, pressed the breath from their lungs, and held them paralyzed in the space between sleeping and waking. When you woke gasping, unable to move, heart pounding, certain something was in the room, that was the mare. That was the nightmare. And this creature, or something very much like it, appeared across essentially every culture on Earth. The Germans called it the Alp. The Italians called it the Strager. In Slavic traditions, it was the Kikimora. The Japanese had the Kashibari spirit. We now know, of course, that what these people were experiencing was sleep paralysis, a completely natural neurological phenomenon where the brain wakes before the body does, leaving the muscles still in their sleep state of immobility. The brain, desperate to explain the sensation of being unable to move, generates the feeling of a presence, a weight, something holding you down. Roughly a quarter of all people alive today have experienced sleep paralysis at least once. In the Middle Ages, every single one of those people had a name for what sat on their chest, and they were terrified of it. But the mayor was only one resident of the medieval night. The world after dark was understood to be genuinely, practically, theologically populated. Not as metaphor, not as story, as fact. St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest theological minds of the 13th century, a man whose intellectual precision shaped Catholic doctrine for centuries, wrote in careful academic Latin about the reality of demonic activity during sleep. The incubus in Aquinas' framework was not a fantasy or a symptom. It was a demon. It operated according to consistent spiritual laws. It could be understood, categorized, resisted, and the way to resist it was prayer. This is the part I find genuinely moving when I sit with it long enough, because these people were not simply superstitious. They were not stupid. They were doing what humans have always done. They were taking an experience that frightened them, that they had no framework to explain, and they were building a structure around it. They were making the terror manageable. They were giving it a name, a shape, a set of rules, and therefore a solution. The solution for almost everyone in medieval Europe was the same. You prayed before bed every night without exception. You prayed. Not a casual mention, not a quicker men before rolling over, a real deliberate, often lengthy ritual of spoken words addressed to God, to Mary, to the saints, to the angels, asking specifically for protection through the hours of darkness. Alcuin of York, a scholar and theologian who advised Charlemagne himself in the 8th century, wrote a bedtime prayer that has survived more than 200 years. It went like this: Christ, though this weary body slumber deep, grant that my heart may keep its watch with thee. O Lamb of God that carried all our sin, guard thou my sleep against the enemy. The enemy, not a vague sense of unease, not abstract anxiety. The enemy, a specific, believed in, genuinely feared adversary that would take advantage of the hours when your eyes were closed and your guard was down. Sleeping in the medieval understanding was a form of vulnerability unlike anything else in daily life. When you were awake, you could resist temptation. You could pray consciously, make choices, keep watch over your own soul. But when you slept, the body was abandoned. The soul lay exposed and the night was full. There was a prayer that medieval children learned, or something very close to it, that has survived in various forms all the way into the 21st century. You may know it. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Bless the bed that I lie on. Four corners to my bed, four angels round my head, one to watch and one to pray, and two to bear my soul away. This prayer, known in England as the Black Paternoster, dates to at least the 16th century and almost certainly has roots in earlier medieval tradition. And when you read it carefully, really read it, you see something that modern retellings tend to quietly skip over. Two to bear my soul away. Two angels stationed at the bed, not for comfort, to carry your soul if you did not survive the night. To people of the Middle Ages, the words, "If I should die before I wake," were not a slightly morbid turn of phrase in a children's prayer. They were a real and present possibility. Adults died in their sleep of illness, of cold, of things that had no name. The night was where the body was most vulnerable. The prayers acknowledged this honestly without softening it. Sleep was small practice in letting go, and the medieval mind was never allowed to fully forget it. Now I want to stay with that for a moment, because I think it says something important, something that might actually be useful right now tonight for you. The medieval relationship with nighttime fear was not denial. They did not pretend the dark was nothing. They did not take a sleep supplement and put on a white noise machine and convince themselves that everything was fine. They looked at the darkness, acknowledged it fully and specifically. This is where danger lives. This is what waits in the hours I cannot see. And then they found a ritual that let them lay the fear down and rest anyway. The prayer was not a lie. It was not pretending that nothing could go wrong. It was an act of deliberate trust in the face of something real. And whether you believe in the theology behind it or not, there is something in that practice, that acknowledgement followed by surrender, that the science of sleep has now quietly rediscovered. The people who sleep best, research consistently shows, are not the people who suppress their anxiety before bed. They are the people who have some ritual, however modest, of consciously setting the day aside. The medieval bedtime prayer was in its way extraordinarily sophisticated. But prayer was not the only defense, because the medieval night held threats that were physical as much as spiritual. In the towns and cities of medieval England, France, and Germany, the moment the sun went down, something extraordinary happened. The bells rang. Not church bells in the usual sense, not calling people to worship. These were curfew bells, a word that comes from the old French couvre-feu, cover the fire. When the curfew bell rang, usually around 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening, it was a legal command. You were required by law to rake the ashes over your household fire, damping it down for the night. One drunk neighbor knocking over a candle could set half a city ablaze by morning. Medieval towns were timber-frame, tightly packed, and built from things that burned magnificently. So the bells rang, the gates of the city locked, and the streets, which had been full of life an hour before, became territory belonging to a different class of person entirely. The Nightwalker statutes, actual laws codified in medieval England, created a legal category for anyone found on the streets after dark. The term was communus noctivus, common night wanderer, and it was not a neutral description. To be a night wanderer was to be automatically suspect, morally disordered, liable to immediate arrest by the night watch. Because in the medieval mind, nothing good happened after dark. Respectable people were indoors. The night belonged to thieves, to debtors, fleeing creditors, to people planning things that could not survive daylight. The night watch, the men assigned to patrol the medieval city streets through the dark hours, was supposed to be the solution to this. Carrying lanterns, walking in pairs, calling out the hours as they passed. In practice, historical records suggest that the night watch was not always what you would call a rigorous institution. There are accounts from London of night watch constables spending entire shifts drinking in taverns, staying warm by the fire while the streets outside went unguarded. In 1617, a report noted that a group of watchmen had spent the night in a victor's house, a kind of informal tavern, drinking and taking tobacco all night long. The watch was supposed to end at dawn, when most danger was feared. And it was apparently at exactly that moment that many watchmen chose to go home early. I find that genuinely humanly relatable. Standing outside in the cold and dark while something frightening might be in the shadows is, in fact, not a fun job. But it does mean that the people sleeping behind their shuttered windows in medieval cities were relying on protection that was at best unreliable, and they knew it and they prayed anyway. There is a quality to medieval nights that I think about often, a quality that I struggle to find the right word for. It is not just fear. Fear is too simple. It is something more like inhabited. The medieval night was inhabited by demons and saints, by the mayor and the angels, by the night watch and the night walker, by wolves at the edge of the village that were sometimes just wolves, and sometimes in the right telling something else entirely. The theologian Craig Kozlowski, who's written extensively on the history of the night in early modern Europe, noted that before the 17th century, associations with night were uniformly negative. The night was a place populated by people of disrepute, by things that should not be named. And yet, and this is the part that I cannot stop turning over, people still slept. They said their prayers. They pulled their cloaks close, they lay down on their straw and their feathers and their ropes, and they let the darkness take them every single night. Not because they were brave in some grand theatrical sense, but because they were tired. And the body, when it is truly tired, eventually overrides even genuine terror. Sleep comes for the frightened and the brave alike. It always has. Something else lived in the medieval night, though. Something softer and in some ways more unsettling than the demons, because the medieval mind was not just afraid of what the darkness contained. It was in a quiet way in relationship with it. There is a tradition in medieval devotional practice called Complain, the last prayer service of the monastic day observed after dark before sleep. In monasteries across Europe, monks gathered in candlelit chapels and prayed together the final prayers of the night. The service included a plea that God would lighten our darkness, an acknowledgement that darkness was real, that it mattered, that it required active spiritual negotiation. And then they went to bed. This is what I mean by inhabited. The darkness was not something to be conquered or eliminated. It was part of the created world, and the created world in medieval theology was the work of God. Even the night, terrifying as it was not abandoned. It was watched over. The question was only by what and by whom. So here is what I want to leave you with from this long, strange night we've been spending together. The medieval world was afraid of the dark in ways that we have mostly lost the ability to truly imagine. They feared the mare that would press the breath from their lungs. They feared the demon that would enter through an open mouth. They feared the night walker in the streets and the fire spreading through the thatched roofs, and the thief who moved in darkness and the plague that came like a shadow in the night. They feared waking to find someone they loved gone. They feared not waking at all. And every single night, without exception, without the comfort of a light switch or a locked deadbolt or a charged phone on the nightstand, they said their prayers and they closed their eyes and they trusted the darkness with their lives. That trust strikes me as one of the most quietly courageous things human beings have ever done, repeated 6 billion times a night across 1,000 years of history. We think of our ancestors as simpler than us. I think they were in this one particular way braver. And yet, even with the fear, even with the demons and the night walkers and the mare on the chest, the medieval night had one more layer to it. Something that most people do not know about. Something that happened regularly in households across medieval Europe in the hours between the first sleep and the second. When people woke in the quiet of the middle of the night in that strange calm that sleep scientists now describe as an altered state, what they did in those hours was not simply pray and go back to sleep. They talked. They made decisions. They reflected on their dreams with the seriousness that we've entirely abandoned. Because in the medieval world, a dream was never just a dream. What it was instead, and what it meant, is something altogether more fascinating. Think about the last dream you remember, not one that made sense, one that felt true. One where the logic of it, however strange, held together while you were inside it. One where you woke up and lay there for a few seconds in that strange liminal space, still half believing that what you just experienced was real. Now ask yourself this: what did you do with that dream? If you are like most people living in the 21st century, the answer is probably not much. Maybe you mentioned it to someone over coffee. Maybe you wrote a few words in a journal. Maybe you Googled one image from it out of mild curiosity and then you moved on. A person in medieval Europe would have found this response almost incomprehensible because to them, a dream was not a mental footnote. It was a document, a communication arriving from somewhere beyond the ordinary waking world, carrying information that needed to be read carefully, discussed seriously, and acted upon sometimes immediately. The medieval understanding of dreams was not simple. I want to be careful about that because there is a temptation to flatten it into something quaint, to imagine a superstitious peasant trembling at visions in the night and calling for the village wise woman. The reality was far more sophisticated than that. The intellectual tradition surrounding dream interpretation in the Middle Ages was layered rigorous and genuinely in dialogue with centuries of Greek, Roman, biblical, and Islamic scholarship. It was in its way the psychology of its era, and it began with a taxonomy, a system, a way of sorting one kind of dream from another because not all dreams were equal. And the medieval mind knew this. The framework that shaped medieval thinking about dreams for nearly 1,000 years came from a 5th century Roman writer named Macrobius, a philosopher and grammarian who wrote a long commentary on a famous text called The Dream of Scipio from the Roman statesman Cicero. In that commentary, Macrobius laid out 5 categories of dreams, 5. And this classification system became so influential that Geoffrey Chaucer referenced it in multiple poems, and educated people across Europe treated it as something close to scientific truth all the way through the medieval period. Here is how the system worked. The first category was the insomnium, what we might loosely translate as the troubled dream. Macrobius considered this the lowest form of dream. It came not from any divine source, but from the body, from hunger, from anxiety, from the disordered workings of a stressed mind. If a laborer dreamed of wolves chasing him after an exhausting day of fear and hard work, that was almost certainly an insomnium. It meant nothing beyond the state of the body that generated it. Dream interpreters generally dismiss these entirely. And here's the thing I find genuinely remarkable. That is a functionally accurate description of what modern neuroscience now understands about stress-induced dreams. The medieval interpretation was wrong in its mechanism, but it was not wrong in its conclusion. Not all dreams deserve equal weight. The anxiety dream that replays your worst day is neurologically different from the quiet, layered, emotionally coherent dream that stays with you for weeks. The medieval mind intuited this distinction. The second category was the visum and apparition. Half waking, half sleeping, the figure glimpsed in the space between. We now understand this as hypnagogic hallucination, the vivid images that flicker at the edge of consciousness as the brain transitions between states. Macrobius filed these under meaningless, which again is not an unreasonable call. But then the system became something genuinely interesting. The 3 remaining categories, the somnium, the visio, and the oraculum, these were the dreams that mattered. The somnium was the enigmatic dream, symbolic, layered, resistant to easy interpretation. Macrobius described it as a dream that conceals with strange shapes and veils. These were the dreams that required actual work, the kind that a skilled interpreter might spend hours unpacking, following the imagery through layers of symbolic meaning. The VO was a prophetic vision, a dream that simply showed you clearly and accurately what was about to happen. And the oraculum, the oracular dream, was perhaps the most significant of all. In an oraculum, a figure of authority appeared, a parent, a revered elder, a saint, an angel. And this figure spoke to you directly and told you something true. To receive anaculum was not merely to have an interesting dream, it was to be addressed by the divine. Now, you might be wondering, how did people know which was which? And this is where the medieval world gets genuinely creative, because the answer was You consulted a book, a dream book. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating and surprisingly sophisticated literary traditions of the Middle Ages, the genre of texts known as somnialia, dream interpretation manuals. And the most famous of all, copied and recopied across Europe from at least the 9th century through the 15th, was a text called the Somni Danielis, the Dream Book of Daniel, named for the Old Testament prophet Daniel, the great biblical dream interpreter, the man who decoded the mysterious visions of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. This manual was one of the most widely copied texts in medieval Europe. Think about that for a moment. Not a legal code, not a theological treatise, a dream book. Organized alphabetically, it listed the subjects and images from dreams alongside their interpretations. If you dreamed of climbing a mountain, here is what it meant. If you dreamed of water or fire or your mother's face or a white horse, turn to the relevant entry and read. The manuscripts were often color-coded. The subject of the dream was written in red. The interpretation was written in black. Practical, organized, designed for quick reference. Scholars believe thousands of unique versions existed across medieval Europe, translated into vernacular Italian, French, German, English. Most are now lost, but enough survive to see the pattern. And the pattern reveals something striking. What was included in these manuals tended to reflect what the people of a given place and time actually worried about. Different regions emphasized different symbols. A dream dictionary from medieval England paid attention to different things than one from medieval southern Italy. The manuals in this way were not just guides to dreams. They were portraits of what a society feared, hoped for, and held sacred. They were, as one scholar put it, portals to the medieval past. There was a second tradition alongside the Somna Danielis, equally widespread and in some ways more personal. This one was called the Somna Yosef, the Dream Book of Joseph, and the way it worked was genuinely unusual. A reader who wished to interpret a dream would first call the dream to mind as clearly as possible. Then they would open a book, often a psalter, a prayer book at random. Whatever letter their eye fell on first, they would take to be the key. Turning back to the Somnia Yusuf, they would read the entry for that letter. The element of chance was deliberate because if God wanted to send you a message through your dreams, surely he could also guide your hand to the right page. There is something I find quietly beautiful about this. It is not random, it is trusted randomness. It is a human being deciding to let go of the need to control the interpretation and instead open the hand and see what arrives. Now, here is where I want to offer a personal observation, and I genuinely believe this. The medieval approach to dreams was in certain key respects more honest than ours. Not more accurate, not more scientifically sound, but more honest about what a dream actually is. We treat dreams today as private noise, as the brain's screensaver firing random images while the real processing happens elsewhere. We have, in a culture obsessed with measurement and productivity, quietly downgraded the dream to something between meaningless and mildly interesting. The medieval person sat with their dream. They brought it to their priest or their friend or their dream book. They asked, "What is this trying to tell me?" They created a practice, a whole intellectual architecture around the idea that the sleeping mind had access to something the waking mind did not. And here's the thing. Neuroscience in the last 30 years has been quietly edging back toward this position. We now know that dreams play a real and specific role in memory consolidation, that the brain during sleep is not resting but reorganizing, processing emotional experience, rehearsing social situations, making connections between things that seemed unrelated in daylight. The medieval person who woke from a vivid dream and spent an hour turning it over, discussing it, sitting with its imagery, they were unknowingly doing something physiologically useful. The first sleep and second sleep, which we talked about earlier, that quiet waking period in the middle of the night was, according to historian Roger Kirsch, often specifically used for this purpose for reflection on dreams. Medieval writers noted that dreams in the first sleep were particularly vivid and emotionally charged. This is consistent with what we know about sleep architecture. The first block of sleep is rich in deep, slow-wave sleep, while the later period is richer in the kind of dreaming that sticks. the medieval sleeper waking naturally in the middle of the night to reflect on what they had just dreamed, was without intending to practicing something remarkably close to what modern sleep therapists now recommend for dream integration. They had accidentally discovered something true. But dreams in the medieval world were not only personal, they were political. And this is where the story takes a turn that I find absolutely extraordinary. In the great courts of medieval Europe, in the halls of kings and the chambers of bishops, a man or woman who could demonstrate the gift of prophetic dreaming occupied a position of real power. The Old Testament had established the precedent clearly. Joseph, the son of Jacob, rose from slavery to become the second most powerful man in Egypt because he could interpret Pharaoh's dreams. Daniel survived the Babylonian court because he could decode the king's impossible visions. Medieval rulers knew these stories by heart, and many of them believed with complete sincerity that God still sent messages through sleep. There is a document from the Japanese imperial court, the Taihei, a 14th century war chronicle that describes Emperor Gigo selecting his military commander, Kusunagi Masashigai, based almost entirely on a portentous dream the emperor had received. And in medieval Europe, the pattern repeated. Kings sought interpretation of their dreams from trusted clergy. Queens reported visions to their confessors. Abbots recorded the dreams of monks in monastery chronicles, treating them as potential divine guidance. A dream could, in the right circumstances, justify a decision or call one into question. It could, if it had the right symbolic content and the right witness, become a form of political authority. There was, however, a profound tension running through all of this, because the church was not entirely comfortable with dream interpretation. Not because it denied that God could speak through dreams. The Bible was full of evidence that he did, but because the church also believed with complete conviction that the devil could speak through dreams too. And the devil in this framework was infinitely more creative and subtle than you might imagine. He did not arrive in dreams with horns and obvious evil. He arrived wearing the faces of the people you trusted most. He sent you visions of apparent divine approval for things that would lead to sin. He made the forbidden seem sanctioned. He made the wrong path shimmer with what looked like holy light. How then were you supposed to tell the difference between a dream that came from God and one that came from the other place? This question preoccupied medieval theologians for centuries, and the answer they arrived at was essentially this. You could not always tell which meant you needed help, which meant the interpretation of significant dreams belonged ultimately to the church. There is something almost clever about this theological structure. By insisting that divine dreams required clerical validation and that demonic dreams looked indistinguishable from divine ones to the untrained mind, the church inserted itself as the necessary interpreter of every sleeper's inner life. Even your dreams were not entirely your own. Even in the deepest privacy of your sleeping mind, there was a framework, a set of authorities, a tradition of interpretation, a body of approved meaning that told you what you had experienced. And yet people dreamed their own dreams anyway. Ordinary people, farmers, merchants, servants, mothers, children had vivid, strange, deeply personal dreams that no dream book adequately captured. And they told each other about them. They sat with them in the darkness of the middle of the night. They made small private meaning from them outside of any official framework. There is a tiny, luminous record from the 14th century, a marginal illustration in a medieval manuscript discovered centuries later, which shows a small figure asleep and dreaming, and then the same figure sitting awake before a group of friends, a book open on his lap telling his dream. The label above the sleeping figure says East Dormant. He sleeps. The label above the waking figure says Hicks Planet Somnia. Here he explains his dreams. I have looked at that illustration many times. There is something so completely recognizably human about it. The man sleeps. He wakes. He gathers his friends around him and tells him what he saw in the night. His face in the little drawing is animated. His hands are probably gesturing. The friends are leaning in. It is the oldest story in the world. We have always dreamed. We have always needed to tell someone. I wonder sometimes what it would do to us if we brought back even a fraction of the seriousness the medieval world gave to dreams. Not the theology of it, Not the specific belief that Pharaoh's cows are predicting your harvest, but the habit of attention, the practice of waking slowly and sitting with what came in the night before the day erased it. The willingness to ask, what did my sleeping mind work out while the waking mind was awake? The medieval person believed the answer mattered enough to write it down, to discuss it, to build an entire literature around it. Maybe they were not entirely wrong. And yet, for all the weight the medieval world placed on what happened inside a sleeping mind, there was something happening outside it at the same time that has received almost no attention. Something communal. Something that involved not just what you dreamed, but who you slept beside and what it meant to share the intimate space of the night with another person. Because the medieval bed, as we have seen, was rarely a solitary place, and the customs surrounding who slept next to whom and the unwritten rules that governed those shared nights reveal a world of social trust and physical closeness that we've almost entirely dismantled. Just ahead, we're going to step into that world, into the shared beds of medieval travelers, into the rules of culture, into the surprisingly tender and surprisingly complex world of what it meant in the Middle Ages to share the night with the stranger. Quick question for you, and I want you to actually think about this one before you answer. When did you last share a bed with a complete stranger? Not a friend you had known for years, not a partner, not a sibling on a holiday trip, a genuine stranger, someone whose name you did not know when the lights went out. If you're like most people listening right now, the answer is probably never. Or, if it happened, it was an emergency, a crisis, a situation that required explanation and perhaps a small amount of collective awkwardness. Because in the world we live in, sleeping alone or at most with one chosen person is considered so fundamentally normal that any deviation from it feels like a story worth telling. Now, hold that feeling because in medieval Europe, what I just described to you, the stranger in the bed, the unnamed body beside you in the dark was simply Tuesday night. It was not a crisis. It was not an emergency. It was not a story worth telling. It was just how nights worked. There is a remarkable fact sitting quietly in the scholarship of medieval history that I think has not received nearly the attention it deserves. Historian George Duby, one of the great scholars of medieval social life, wrote in his monumental study of private life in the medieval world that there was no classical or medieval Latin word equivalent to our modern word privacy. The closest Latin term was proio, which meant essentially a taking away, a loss. To be private in the medieval Latin sense was not to have something, solitude, sanctuary, a space of one's own. It was to be deprived of something, of community, of company, of the warmth and presence of other human bodies. Let that land for a moment. The thing we chase, the thing we pay enormous amounts of money to create and protect and name as a fundamental human right was, for most of human history, understood as a form of poverty. To sleep alone was not luxury. To sleep alone was often to be unfortunate. The family bed in the Middle Ages was not a private retreat. It was in the truest sense a communal space in a typical medieval household. Not the grand noble estate, not the peasant's one-room cottage, but the wide middle band of society, the craftsmen and merchants and minor clergy. The sleeping arrangements followed a logic that was entirely social. The husband and wife slept in the center of the bed. The daughters arranged themselves on the side nearest the wall with the youngest closest to her mother. The sons on the other side also arranged by age, and then, and this is the part modern readers tend to stumble over, guests, not close friends, not relatives who had traveled a long way. Guests, people who had arrived that evening and needed a place to sleep. They were placed on the outer edges of the bed, farthest from the center, and that was where they slept. The household's intimacy arranged in concentric circles with the sleeping bodies of strangers at the periphery. And nobody found this strange. Nobody wrote about it as unusual or uncomfortable or requiring any particular adjustment of expectation. It was simply how you showed hospitality. You made room. Now, the inn is where this gets truly interesting to me, because the inn strips away even the thin veneer of familiarity. At home, the strangers sharing your bed were at least strangers you had chosen to invite. At an inn, you had no choice at all. When a traveler in medieval England arrived at an entired road dusty, paying their coin for a night's lodging, they were not handed a room key. They were shown to a bed, sometimes in a room with 5 or 6 other beds, each holding 2 or 3 or 4 people. Sometimes they shared a bed with someone who had arrived an hour before them, sometimes with someone who was already asleep. The etiquette around this was real and taken seriously. There were actual understood rules for being, in the phrase of the era, a considerate bedfellow. You lay still. You did not sprawl across the middle of the bed claiming territory. You did not hog the blankets, an act of such social offense that it was worth remarking upon in writing. You kept to your half, your quarter, whatever portion of the sleeping surface had implicitly been assigned to you by your position in the arrival order. And you did not, under any circumstances, make it somebody else's problem that you were there. There is something almost touching about these rules. In a world without private space, without legal protections for personal territory, without any mechanism to prevent a stranger from being laid beside you in the dark, the best available social technology was simply the expectation of stillness. Please be still. That is all. Please be still, and we will both get through the night. And yet, and I want to be genuinely careful here because this is where the history gets interesting rather than just quaint. These shared sleeping arrangements were not simply neutral. They were not just practical arrangements that people tolerated with gritted teeth. They were, in their way, genuinely intimate. The historian Lucy Worley, in her brilliant Social History of the English Home, made a point that has stayed with me: sleeping alone in a grand 16th century English bed. She wrote, would have been a rather lonely experience. Not peaceful, not luxurious, lonely, because the communal bed was not just where you slept. It was where you talked, away from the work of the day, away from the listening ears of the broader household, or as away from them as you could get with the servants at the foot of the bed. The bed was where conversations happened that could not happen elsewhere. Siblings whispered secrets to each other in the dark. Husbands and wives talked with a candor the daylight hours did not permit. Women who shared beds with female servants sometimes found the formality of the mistress-servant relationship softening in ways that surprised everyone, including themselves. And travelers lying beside strangers in the middle of the night at some roadside inn between London and the north. Those travelers sometimes talked too, about where they were going, about what they had seen, about the strange world they moved through together. There is a reason the word bedfellow once meant close companion, trusted confidant. It was not metaphor. It was literal. You shared the most vulnerable hours of your existence with this person. That meant something. Here is a story I want to sit with you for a moment. It is the year 1776. 2 men arrive at an inn in New Brunswick, New Jersey, after a long day of travel. The inn has only 1 room left. The room has only 1 bed. The 2 men are Benjamin Franklin, 70 years old, the most famous American alive, and John Adams, 41, a lawyer from Massachusetts, who is rapidly becoming one of the most important figures in the young republic. They share the bed and they spend a meaningful portion of the night arguing. Not about politics, not about independence, not about the enormous things they were both in the middle of reshaping. They argued about whether to keep the window open or closed. Franklin believed firmly in the healthful benefits of fresh night air. Adams was cold and wanted the window shut. Franklin apparently won. Adams recorded the whole episode in his diary with a mixture of exasperation and wonder. This great man, this legendary figure lying next to him in the dark, lecturing him about the circulation of air while the New Jersey night came in through the open window. I love this story because it is so completely recognizably human, because it reminds you that the people who made history were also just people tired, cold, opinionated about windows needing somewhere to put their bodies at the end of the day. And it also shows how recently the shared bed was simply the expected reality. Franklin and Adams were not poor. They were not traveling in desperate circumstances. They were distinguished men of letters who simply accepted, without much apparent protest, that a shared bed with a near stranger was what a night away from home looked like. This was the world that the medieval tradition had built, and it did not fully end until the Victorians decided in the 19th century that communal sleeping was not merely inconvenient but actively immoral. The Victorians, it turns out, are responsible for sleeping alone. Or at least they are responsible for making sleeping alone the aspirational standard. As the 19th century progressed, the Victorian home expanded rooms, multiplied corridors, appeared the architecture of the house itself was reorganized around the principle of separation. Individual bedrooms became the mark of a civilized household. The idea took hold gradually, then all at once, that communal sleeping was associated with poverty, with the lower classes, with a kind of moral looseness that respectable people ought to avoid. There were even medical arguments. A canary bird hung in a curtained bedstead where two people slept, wrote one 19th century physician with real alarm, died before the morning. The implication being clear. If it kills the canary, imagine what it does to you. Disease anxiety, understandable given the cholera epidemics and tuberculosis crises of the era, fused with class aspiration and Protestant ideas about moral propriety to produce something entirely new. The private bedroom, the individual bed, the idea that your sleeping body was yours alone, sealed off from the breathing and warmth and presence of other humans for the entire night. It was by any historical measure an extraordinary invention, and we have lived inside it so completely for so long that we've entirely forgotten it is an invention at all. What strikes me most when I sit with all of this is not the strangeness of medieval communal sleeping. It is how much was carried in it that we have quietly lost. The family arranged in order in the bed, the youngest near the mother. The daughters and sons sorted by age against the wall. The guest at the outer edge given room made welcome. There is a whole social philosophy in that arrangement, a whole map of values. Who matters? Who is protected? Who is welcomed in us, expressed not in words or laws or speeches, but simply in the order of bodies in the dark and in the strangers lying still beside each other in the night, observing their unspoken rules of stillness and courtesy. There is something there too, something about the shared vulnerability of sleep, about the fact that for a few hours in the middle of the night, the merchant from London and the farmer from the north and the monk traveling between monasteries were all equally horizontal, all equally tired, all equally in need of rest. Sleep has always been the great leveler. The king closes his eyes and loses his kingdom for a few hours. The peasant closes his eyes and is briefly no one's serf. In the shared bed of the medieval inn, the differences of rank that governed every daylight hour were for a little while suspended. Not erased, never erased. The rules of who got the outer edge of the bed and who got the center were still very much in effect, but softened, suspended, made briefly less absolute by the simple shared fact of needing to sleep. There is one more thing I want to tell you about the medieval sleeping world before we move on. Something that happened in the great households of England and France that I find almost impossible to imagine today. In the grandest houses, the palaces and manor houses and episcopal residences where real power lived, the bedchamber of the lord or the king was not a private room. It was a public one. Access to the royal bedchamber was a privilege, a political statement, a mark of trust and favor, to be invited to stand in the presence of a king while he prepared for sleep, to be one of the select few allowed past the curtain into the space where he was most human, most vulnerable. That was power. The ritual of the royal bedtime was a performance. The king was undressed by specific attendants who held specific titles. He was prayed over. He was given warmed wine. He was settled into the enormous embroidered canopied bed that announced his status to anyone who had been granted the considerable privilege of seeing it. And then the curtains were drawn, and in the morning the performance reversed. The curtains were opened. The attendants returned. The king was dressed and prayed over again, and the day began. The private moment, the moment between the closing and opening of those curtains, was perhaps the only truly private moment a medieval king ever had. And even then, someone was sleeping on the floor outside the door just in case. Think about that the next time you walk into your bedroom and close the door. That door, that room, that expectation of uninterrupted darkness and silence and solitude. These are extraordinarily recent gifts. Gifts that most humans who have ever lived did not have. Gifts that medieval people could not have imagined as something to want. Because the wanting of them, the desire for that sealed-off silence had not yet been invented. They slept together, They lay in the dark together, breathing together, keeping each other warm. They were in their sleep more fully in the presence of other humans than most of us are at almost any point in our waking lives. And I wonder sometimes when the room is too quiet and the night feels too empty, whether something was lost when we learned to sleep alone. But the communal bed, for all its warmth, was not always safe. Because the medieval night, for all the prayers and the bedmates and the carefully observed rules of stillness, held dangers that no amount of human company could prevent. Dangers that came from the very straw and feathers and rope and wood that made up the beds themselves. Dangers that were invisible, that crept in silence, that killed without warning or explanation or the possibility of defense. The history of sickness and suffering in the medieval night is not comfortable, but it is real. And it is a story that medicine, history, and biology together are only now beginning to fully understand. There is a question I've been sitting with for a while now, and I want to share it with you because I think it opens something genuinely interesting. If you had to name the single institution that most shaped daily life in medieval Europe, not the king, not the lord, not the market, what would you say? Most historians would answer the same way. The church, the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages, was not simply a place you went on Sundays. It was the architecture of existence itself. It decided when you were born into community, when you married, when you could bury your dead. And this is the part that still strikes me every time I think about it. It had opinions about your sleep. Strong ones, detailed ones, opinions about how long you should sleep, when you should sleep, what position you should sleep in, who was allowed to be next to you when you slept, and under what circumstances sleep itself became a sin. The church, in other words, did not stop at the door of the bedroom. It walked right in and sat down at. Let us start with something that sounds almost comic, but is entirely true. In medieval Catholic theology, sleeping too much was a sin. Not metaphorically, not just frowned upon, a sin. Classified, documented, and assigned its place in the hierarchy of moral failure. The sin in question was acedia, or in its more familiar modern form, sloth, one of the 7 deadly sins first enumerated by Saint Gregory the Great in the 6th century and elaborated with extraordinary precision by Saint Thomas Aquinas in the 13th. But here is the nuance that most modern people miss. Acedia was not simply laziness, it was something more specific and more spiritually alarming. It was a willful refusal of joy, a turning away from God's goodness, a kind of spiritual numbness that manifested in one of its most recognizable forms as excessive sleep. In medieval Christian art, sloth was frequently depicted as a sleeping figure, not a resting figure, a sleeping one. Eyes closed, body slack, unconscious to the obligations of the soul. The warning from Saint Philip Neri, a Renaissance-era priest, but drawing on deep medieval roots, was blunt. We should not spend too much time sleeping, since heaven is not for sluggards. Heaven is not for sluggards. I find that sentence almost endearing in its directness. And yet, and this is the tension that I find genuinely fascinating, the same theology that called excessive sleep sinful also taught that sleep itself was sacred. That every night you lay down, you were performing an act of faith. You were entrusting your body, your breath, your soul to God for the hours you could not watch over yourself. One medieval prayer put it with quiet beauty: grant us a tranquil night free from all disturbance, that, after an interval of quiet sleep, we may by thy bounty at the return of light be endued with activity from the Holy Spirit. Sleep was not laziness. Sleep was recovery, renewal, preparation for another day of service. The problem was only when sleep exceeded what was necessary. But who decided what was necessary? Well, the church had thoughts on that too. 7 hours was a common recommendation from medieval medical and religious texts, enough to restore the body without indulging it, enough to serve God effectively the next day without so much that the hours of potential prayer were squandered in unconsciousness. 7 hours, which, as a small irony of history, is almost exactly what modern sleep scientists recommend as the minimum for optimal human function. The medieval church, for entirely different reasons, arrived at roughly the same number. I'm not sure what to do with that coincidence, but I enjoy it enormously. Now, if the layperson was expected to manage 7 hours and avoid the sin of sloth, The monks had a considerably more complicated arrangement because the monastic schedule, particularly under the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and followed in some form by monasteries across Europe for the next 1,000 years, did not simply set a bedtime. It engineered the night. Under the Benedictine rule, a monastic day was organized around 8 canonical hours, fixed moments of prayer distributed across the full cycle of day and night. And I do mean night. The day in a Benedictine monastery began at roughly 9 o'clock in the evening with Compline, the final prayer service, the one we mentioned before the completion of the day, then bed, genuine sleep, but only until approximately 2 o'clock in the morning. At that hour, an hour that most of us today associate with being unreasonably awake, the bell would ring, and every monk in the monastery would rise from his bed in the cold dark and walk to the chapel. This was matins, also called the night office, sometimes called vigils, the longest and most important of the 8 prayer hours. Chanted, sung, prayed together in the candlelit darkness while the rest of the world was entirely profoundly asleep. And then after matins, perhaps another brief period of rest lords at around 3 or 4 in the morning, prayer again, and then prime at 6 and tur at 9. The prayers continued through the day like a tide pulling the monks back to chapel at regular intervals, shaping every hour around the rhythm of worship. Think about what that schedule required. You went to bed at 9 o'clock in the evening. You woke at 2 o'clock in the morning. You prayed in the dark for an hour or more. You may have slept briefly again afterward. And then the day began. Here is something I want you to sit with for a moment because it changes how I see this completely. Those monks rising at 2 in the morning, walking through cold stone corridors to a candle-lit chapel, chanting psalms in the darkness. While the world slept, they were not being punished. They believed they were doing something that mattered more than sleep. Saint Benedict's rule quoted the Psalms directly in its justification. At midnight, I rise to praise you, and 7 times a day I praise you. The night office was not an interruption of rest. It was the point, the hours of darkness which the world outside feared and locked its gates, against which ordinary people stuffed with prayers for protection and ritual objects and superstitious hope. Those same hours inside the monastery walls were hours of deliberate sanctification. The monks were in their understanding holding the darkness open, filling the night with something other than fear. I find that extraordinarily moving even now, even from the outside. There is another layer to this that goes deeper still, because the Church's regulation of sleep was not only about how long you slept or when you woke. It extended with a thoroughness that will either impress or slightly alarm you into every other dimension of the sleeping body, starting with what you wore or more precisely what you did not wear. Medieval illuminated manuscripts, the beautifully decorated books produced in monasteries and noble households across Europe, frequently depicted people sleeping in the nude. Particularly in earlier medieval centuries, sleeping without clothing was simply what most people did. The nightshirt and nightgown as specific garments designed for sleep only became widespread toward the 16th century. But even before then, the Church had opinions. There were monastic rules that specified monks should sleep fully clothed, or at least partially clothed, so that they would be ready to rise instantly for the night office without the delay or immodesty of dressing in the dark. The rule of Saint Benedict addressed this directly. Monks should sleep clothed belted so they might rise without delay and be prepared at any hour. The practical reason is clear enough, but underneath it is something else. A theology of the body that was always slightly uneasy with its own nakedness. That associated vulnerability with spiritual danger that preferred even the sleeping body to be covered contained prepared. And then there was the question of who was in the bed with you. For married couples in medieval Europe, the marriage bed was in theory a space of sanctioned intimacy. But the Church's canon law, that vast and elaborate body of religious legislation, had extensive thoughts about what that intimacy was permitted to include and when. The list of days on which marital relations were prohibited reads to modern eyes as something between a legal document and a comedy sketch. No Sunday, which was the Lord's Day. No Thursday in memory of the arrest of Christ. No Friday in commemoration of the crucifixion. No Saturday in honor of the Virgin Mary. And then no intercourse during Lent. No intercourse during Advent in the weeks before Christmas. No intercourse during Easter week. No intercourse during Pentecost week. No intercourse on the feast days of major saints. And the medieval calendar was abundantly supplied with major saints. No intercourse when a woman was pregnant or nursing or in her monthly cycle. When historians have tallied all the prohibited days against the calendar, the number of theoretically permissible nights in a medieval marriage, when both the season was right and none of the prohibitions applied, comes out to somewhere between 40 and 80 days a year, less than a quarter of the year. Approximately a third of the nights you would actually be in bed together. Now, to be very clear, most historians believe that the actual behavior of medieval married people was considerably more relaxed than these rules suggested. There's plenty of evidence that ordinary people ignored large swaths of canon law when it came to the private hours. By the 12th century, the church itself had mostly shifted these prohibitions from absolute commands to earnest suggestions. But the rules existed. They were preached. They were part of the moral atmosphere that settled over the medieval marriage bed every single night. Even if you chose not to follow them, you knew they were there. And that knowledge, that constant low-level awareness of a theological framework hovering just above the straw mattress, shaped the experience of the medieval night in ways that are genuinely difficult for us to fully imagine. There is one more dimension of the church's relationship to sleep that I want to share with you because I think it is the most unexpected of all. It has to do with sleep as punishment. The medieval church had a concept largely forgotten now of holy insomnia, deliberate sleep deprivation as a form of devotion. There were saints who became celebrated precisely for how little they slept. Saint John Vianney, the 19th century French parish priest who is remembered as one of the great confessors of the Catholic tradition, spent the last decade of his life hearing confessions for as many as 16 to 18 hours a day, sleeping perhaps 2 or 3 hours a night, sometimes less. But this tradition has roots that go back much further back into the heart of the medieval monastic tradition. The Desert Fathers of the early Christian centuries had already established sleep deprivation as a form of spiritual discipline. To resist sleep was to resist the body's demands. To stay awake in the dark was to remain vigilant, alert to God, unavailable to the temptations that came in the unguarded hours. The 11th century monk Raoul Glaber wrote about a demon who tempted him in bed, whispering that he should simply stay in the warmth of his blankets a little longer, that there was no need to rise so quickly for the morning office. That rest was its own form of virtue. A demon whispering not to make him do something terrible, just to make him sleep in. There is something almost tender about that story when you sit with it, because the demon's argument honestly is not without merit. 5 more minutes. The darkness says, you are warm, you are comfortable, the office can wait. And the monk pulling on his sandals in the dark, choosing the cold stone floor over the warm straw, is performing an act of will that most of us with our alarms and our snooze buttons and our deeply reasonable desire for just a little more sleep would completely understand the temptation to abandon. What I keep coming back to when I think about all of this, the rules about duration, about clothing, about the marriage bed, about holy wakefulness, is how totalizing the medieval church's claim on the sleeping body truly was. There was no sphere of life so private that it was beyond the reach of religious regulation. Not the moment you closed your eyes, not the way you lay, not what you wore or did not wear, not who was permitted to lie beside you or what you were permitted to do in the dark. The medieval self did not have a fully private interior life in the way that we understand privacy today. Every room, even the bedroom, every hour, even the sleeping ones, every breath, even the unconscious ones, all of it was in some sense witnessed, regulated, held within a framework of meaning and obligation that never quite switched off. And yet people laughed and played and loved and slept, sometimes following the rules precisely, often not. Because the human body, with its stubbornness and its warmth and its absolute insistence on rest, has never been entirely governable. Not by kings, not by law, and not even as the snoring monk and the sleeping servant and the married couple who counted feast days loosely could all tell you by God. Or at least not by the intermediaries who claimed to speak for him. But even with all of this, the theology, the rules, the canonical hours, the holy insomnia, there was one thing the church could not fully control. One place it could not follow the medieval sleeper. The mind in the hours of sleep went somewhere the waking world could not reach. It dreamed. And in the medieval world, a dream was not random noise from a sleeping brain. It was a message, a visitation, sometimes a warning. The question was only who or what had sent it. And that question, as it turns out, was one that the church had very strong opinions about, strong enough to write books, strong enough to shape policy, strong enough to change lives. But that story belongs to what comes next. Something wakes you, not fully, just enough. The slow, sluggish, half-consciousness where you know you are in bed but cannot quite remember why or what time it is, or whether what you just felt was a dream or something real. You lie still. You wait, and then it comes again, a slight sensation. Heat. Maybe a dampness under your arms. A dull ache somewhere you cannot quite locate. For most of us, this moment ends one of two ways. You roll over and go back to sleep. Or you reach for your phone, Google your symptoms at 2 in the morning, catastrophize briefly, and eventually drift off again, reassured that you are probably not dying. Now imagine living that same moment, that same half-waking, that same bodily uncertainty in the 14th century. No phone, no doctor within easy reach, no understanding of bacteria, of viruses, of the mechanisms by which disease enters the body and travels through it. Just the darkness and whatever was happening inside you, and the very real knowledge that people who had felt exactly this way, that faint wrongness, that first warmth of fever, had sometimes not woken up again. Of all the ways that the medieval night differed from our own, none was more stark than this. Sleep in the Middle Ages was where disease did some of its most efficient work. Not because illness was worse at night in any medical sense, but because the night was when the body was most defenseless, when there were no distractions, when the fever you had managed to ignore through the busyness of the day revealed itself fully quietly in the stillness, and because the sleeping body was intimately connected to everything around it, the straw beneath it, the animals nearby, the person pressed close for warmth, the thatch roof above dropping debris. The night was genuinely physically a place where illness moved. Think about what we now know about the fleas. The oriental rat flea, the primary vector of the bacterium that caused the Black Death, was, as historical records note with a grim specificity, a creature of nocturnal habits. It preferred warm, dark places. It lived in clothing and bedding. In the straw filling of mattresses, the flea's host, the black rat, was also strongly nocturnal, most active after dark, moving through the grain stores and the floors and the walls of the same buildings where people slept. The moment a rat died of plague, its fleas sought a new host. And if you were lying in the dark on your straw mattress, warm and still and breathing, you were, from the flea's perspective, an excellent alternative. The Black Death did not come to medieval Europe in the dramatic fashion of a battlefield. It came quietly at night into beds. The Black Death itself is a number so large it resists comprehension. Between the years 1347 and 1351, just 4 years, it killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population. In some regions, the death toll was higher. The Italian chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the plague in Florence, described a city so devastated that the dead were loaded onto carts and taken to mass graves without ceremony, without mourning, simply removed the way you remove something that can no longer wait. Boccaccio wrote that the disease was so contagious that the mere touching of the clothes appeared to itself to communicate the malady. He was not wrong. Research in 2018 suggested that, in addition to flea bites from rats, the plague may also have spread through human body lice, the same parasites that nested in hair and clothing, in the wool blankets that kept medieval people warm through the night. You slept with your warmth, and your warmth in many cases was also carrying the thing that would take you. But the Black Death, catastrophic as it was, is not the disease I find most fascinating in the history of medieval sleep. Because the Black Death was a recognizable enemy, it had known symptoms. It had been seen before in different forms across centuries of human history. The disease I keep returning to is one that most people today have never heard of. A disease so strange, so sudden, and so specific to its own era that it appeared without warning, vanished without explanation. And to this day, more than 500 years later, no one can say with complete certainty what it was. The English called it simply the sweat. In the summer of 1485, something extraordinary happened in England. Henry Tudor had just defeated King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, ending the Wars of the Roses and seizing the English throne as King Henry VIII. It should have been a moment of celebration. Instead, within 3 weeks of Henry's arrival in London, a new disease appeared, something the city had never seen before. It began at night. A sudden sense of dread, not quite pain, not quite fear, but something in between. A cold presentiment that something was wrong. Then chills. Then sweating so heavy and so cold that victims soaked through their bedding within hours. Then fever. Then a profound crushing weakness. Then shortness of breath, chest pain, a racing pulse, and then in many cases, often within 24 hours of the first symptom, death. The physician Thomas Festia, a French doctor practicing in London during the first outbreak, wrote of watching 2 priests standing together in the street, talking, and both of them dying suddenly where they stood. He wrote, "We saw 2 priests standing together and speaking together, and we saw both of them die suddenly." The disease killed 15,000 people in London in 6 weeks in a city of under 60,000. That was 1 in 4 people. The sweating sickness, the Zudor Anglicus, as it was known in Latin, struck England 5 times over the next 66 years. 1485, 1508, 1517, 1528, 1551. Each outbreak arriving in the heat of summer, killing its thousands and then vanishing. Between outbreaks, nothing. No residual cases, no slow burn. It simply stopped. And then after 1551, it disappeared entirely, has never returned. Whatever it was, it is gone, leaving behind only the records of those who witnessed it, and a medical mystery that modern researchers are still working to unravel. 2 features of the disease strike me as particularly extraordinary. First, it moved so fast that people who felt perfectly healthy when they went to bed were sometimes dead by morning. The chronicler Richard Grafton wrote that it was so sore, so painful and sharp, that the like was never heard of to any man's remembrance before that time. This from men whose grandfathers had survived the Black Death. Second, it seemed to specifically prefer the wealthy. Unlike most diseases of the era which fell hardest on the poor, the malnourished, the crowded, the sweating sickness disproportionately killed young, healthy, well-fed men and women of the upper classes. It killed Cardinal Wolsey's household twice, and contracted it and survived. Henry VIII was so terrified of it that during the 1528 outbreak he moved to a different bed in a different location every single night, trying to stay ahead of the disease. The king slept in a different bed every night, not from restlessness, from fear. Let me stay with Henry VII for a moment because I think the image is worth sitting with. Here was the most powerful man in England, a man who commanded armies, dissolved monasteries, reshaped the church, a man who executed people for displeasing him, and he was so afraid of a disease he could not see, could not understand, could not fight with any of the weapons at his disposal that he became essentially a fugitive in his own palace, moving through the night, changing beds, trying to outrun something that traveled invisibly. Fear, it turns out, has no interest in power. The Black Death killed lords and peasants with equal indifference. The sweating sickness killed the wealthy with particular enthusiasm. Tuberculosis, which the medieval world called consumption, because it seemed to slowly consume its victims from inside, killed artists and monks and courtiers across centuries. The night was democratic in a way that medieval society otherwise refused to be. And here's where it gets genuinely strange in a way I have thought about many times. The medieval treatment for the sweating sickness was go to bed. When the first symptoms appeared, physicians and common wisdom alike prescribed the same thing. Return immediately to bed. Cover yourself completely. Stay still. Do not move. Do not sleep. And wait out the 24 hours. Do not sleep. The physician John Keyes, who witnessed and documented the 1551 outbreak with great care, believed that falling asleep during the active phase of the sweating sickness was fatal. That sleep in this particular context meant death. There are accounts of family members keeping vigil over a sick person for an entire night, talking to them, touching them, doing anything to prevent the afflicted person from drifting off. Because if you slept, the thinking went, you might not wake up. And in that belief, which we cannot entirely dismiss, because we still do not know precisely what the sweating sickness was, there is something that inverts everything we have been exploring. Sleep in normal circumstances was where the body healed, where God watched over you, where the vulnerable hours were held within something larger than yourself. But in the presence of this particular disease, sleep was the enemy. The bed, which was supposed to be sanctuary, became the place where you had to fight to stay awake, where the hardest thing was not to close your eyes. Pull back from the sweating sickness, and you find illness woven through the medieval night in every direction you look. Tuberculosis, slow, quiet, persistent, was endemic across medieval Europe. It thrived in exactly the conditions the medieval poor lived in. Crowded, poorly ventilated rooms, shared sleeping spaces, cold, damp air. It was spread through the breath of those sleeping nearby. A family sharing a bed with a consumptive parent or sibling was breathing through every night the same air that was slowly filling that person's lungs with something that would eventually take them. No one knew this. You could not see breath the way you could see a flea. The mechanism was invisible. The church explained illness as divine punishment for sin. Medieval medicine explained it as an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and prescribed accordingly bloodletting, dietary changes, herbal preparations, prayer. Some of these remedies worked in limited ways for limited conditions. Most of them did not address what was actually happening inside the body. And so people died in their beds of things we now cure in an afternoon with a course of antibiotics. They died of infections that entered through small wounds, of fevers that broke a week too late, of the kind of ordinary dysentery that today's traveler treats with a pill and a sports drink. What I find most difficult to hold when I think about all of this is not the scale of the death. It is the intimacy of it, because medieval death was not separate from medieval life. It happened in the same room, in the same bed, often. When the plague came to a household, the dying happened where the living happened. There was no hospital to be taken to, no room to be isolated, and no professional barrier between the person dying and the people who loved them. You watched, you stayed, and often you caught it. And this is why when medieval people said the words, "If I should die before I wake," they were not being morbid. They were being accurate. The person in the next bed might already be sick. The flea in the straw beneath you might already have bitten a dying rat. The first sensation of the sweating sickness might already be the slight unease you had dismissed as tiredness. The medieval night held genuine danger in it. Not imagined, not theological, not the projection of a fearful mind, real biological present. And yet, here is what stays with me every time I read through these accounts. People still had children. They still laughed at bad jokes and argued about harvests and fell in love and made plans for the spring. They said their prayers and closed their eyes and slept, not because they were unaware of what the night might hold, but because the alternative, remaining awake forever, armored against every possible threat, was not living at all. There is a kind of courage in ordinary sleep, in the willingness to become unconscious in a world that could change completely while you were not watching. Every person who has ever closed their eyes in the history of the world has performed that small act of faith that the morning will come, that they will be in it. Sleep was the great gamble, and in the medieval world the stakes were simply more visible than they are for most of us now. But even for those who understood the risk, even for those who'd already lost someone to the fever in the night, or the flea in the straw, or the invisible breath of a sick neighbor, the morning still came. Most mornings for most people, and when it did, there was something extraordinary waiting in the hours before full waking. A territory that medieval people took more seriously than we do. A space that belonged neither entirely to sleep nor entirely to consciousness. The place where the dreams lived, and where, if you believed what the medieval world believed, and many very intelligent people did, God or something else entirely sometimes chose to speak. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. Think of the last time you heard a lullaby. Maybe you sang one? Maybe someone sang one to you a long time ago. Maybe you just heard one in passing, hummed by someone with a baby on their shoulder. That particular soft repetition that exists in every human culture and every human language. Lul lul bob or my bond sleeps softly now. The sound of it is ancient. It goes back further than written history, back to the earliest human families, to mothers in the dark trying to coax an infant into the unconsciousness of sleep. And the strange thing about lullabies, the thing that has always quietly unsettled me, is how many of them, when you look closely at the words, are not entirely gentle, the medieval ones especially. But we will get to that. Let us start with the cradle itself, because the story of the medieval cradle is more complicated and more quietly heartbreaking than it first appears. For most of human history, the question of where a baby slept at night was not primarily a question of comfort. It was a question of survival. In the medieval period, the dominant practice across peasant households, merchant families, noble estates was co-sleeping. The baby in the family bed nestled between the warmth of its mother and whoever else lay there that night. This was practical. A nursing mother needed to be able to feed her child through the night without rising. In a cold stone cottage with a dying fire, the warmth of nearby bodies was not optional. It was the difference between a child who survived the winter and one who did not. But the church had concerns. Serious, repeated, insistent concerns, because co-sleeping in the medieval record was also associated with something the authorities called overlying. Overlying was exactly what it sounds like. A sleeping parent exhausted from a day of physical labor would unconsciously roll toward the infant in the night. The child would be pressed against a body, against blankets, against the straw of the mattress, and sometimes the child would not cry out in time. The coroner's records of medieval England document these deaths with a matter-of-fact regularity that is genuinely difficult to read today. Inquest after inquest in county after county, recording the same quiet tragedy. An infant found in the morning cold beside a sleeping parent who did not know. Modern medicine now understands these deaths as falling under a range of causes, some of which are what we today call sudden infant death syndrome. Others genuinely cases of accidental suffocation. But the medieval world had no such distinction. It knew only the outcome, and the church placed the moral weight of it squarely on the shoulders of the mother. Women were asked about it in the confessional. Sermons warned against it from the pulpit. The risk of overlying was treated as a spiritual failure as much as a physical accident, evidence of insufficient vigilance over the most vulnerable person in the household. The solution that medieval society developed slowly, imperfectly, unevenly, was the cradle. A separate raised sleeping space for the infant, rocked to soothe, positioned safely apart from the adult bodies nearby. Cradles appear in medieval manuscripts and paintings, always beside the mother's bed, always close enough for the nursing mother to reach without rising fully. Some were wooden and simple. Some in wealthier households were elaborately carved and suspended from ceiling hooks, swinging gently with the motion of the room. The rocking was not merely a comfort, though it was certainly that. Medieval physicians, drawing on the classical theory of the four humors, believed that gentle motion aided the infant's digestion, moved the humors properly through the small body, and encouraged the natural rhythms of sleep. Rocking was described in one medical text as a form of exercise, the one form that even a wrapped and swaddled newborn could receive. So important was the rocking that in wealthier households there existed a dedicated position, the cradle rocker, an actual person employed specifically to rock the cradle. I want to let that land for a moment because it is both perfectly logical and absolutely wonderful. In an age before baby monitors and automatic cradle rockers, if you could afford a dedicated human being whose entire job was to stand beside the cradle and rock it, you hired one. I have tried to imagine that job, and I genuinely cannot decide if it sounds peaceful or maddening. Probably both, depending on the night, but the medieval infant faced dangers in sleep that no cradle entirely solved. The numbers when you encounter them are simply hard to absorb. Across medieval Europe, historians estimate that approximately 1 in 4 infants died before their first birthday. 1 in 4. Not from any single catastrophic event. From the accumulated weight of winter, of cold, of illness, of the constant proximity of animals and insects and disease, from the simple fragility of a body that had not yet developed enough resistance to a world that offered very little of it. And between the first birthday and puberty, roughly another quarter of those who had survived infancy would die. That means that in a medieval village in an ordinary year without plague and without famine, half of the children born would not live to see their adolescence. Half. This is the number that, once you really sit with it, changes everything about how you read medieval history. Every parent you encounter in a medieval document, every mother, every father, every set of grandparents has almost certainly already buried at least one child. Many have buried several. There is a debate among historians about whether medieval parents faced with these odds form the same kind of deep emotional bonds with their infants that modern parents do. The French historian Philippe Arias argued influentially and controversially that medieval people did not fully recognize childhood as a distinct stage of life. That emotional distance was a kind of protective response to the certainty of loss. I find this argument unconvincing, not because it lacks logic, but because the evidence contradicts it so thoroughly and so tenderly. There is the miracle story of an 8-year-old boy named Philip from Cheshire who fell into a river and drowned. His father, Hugh, found the body, and in the account that survived, groaned and sighed in despair. When Philip's mother received the news, she wept openly. Both parents refused to accept his death. They prayed. They called on the saints. They fought with the only weapons they had against the thing that had taken their child. That is not emotional distance. That is grief. Plain, recognizable human grief. There is the account of King Edward III of England and his wife Eleanor. They had 16 children together. Of their 5 sons, only one, the last, survived to adulthood. Of their 11 daughters, 6 died before the age of 3. 16 children, 11 surviving to adulthood. And Edward the First was one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, a man with access to every physician and resource available in his era. Wealth offered no real protection. It only made the view of mortality slightly more comfortable. Now let me come back to the lullaby, because the medieval lullaby, when you trace it carefully, reveals something about the interior life of medieval parents that no chronicle or legal document quite captures. The earliest recorded English lullabies come from the 14th and 15th centuries. They take a form that seems at first merely religious. The Virgin Mary singing to the infant Christ, a theological tableau dressed in the familiar sounds of a mother comforting her baby. But look more closely. The most famous of these, the Coventry Carol, which originated as part of a mystery play cycle performed in the city of Coventry, is a lullaby sung by the mothers of Bethlehem to their children. The children about to be killed at Herod's command in the massacre of the innocents. Lully Lul, thou little tiny child. Bye-bye, Lily Lul. A lullaby of farewell. A mother singing her child to sleep, knowing in the world of the play, in the weight of the theology, that the child would not wake. This was performed publicly before audiences of medieval men and women who had many of them already buried children of their own, and they wept. The medieval lobby was not always innocent. It was sometimes a lament dressed in the language of sleep, a grief too large to say directly wrapped in the sounds of comfort. There was also the oldest English nursery lullaby tradition, the cluster of surviving 14th and 15th century verses, in which the Virgin sings to the Christ child words like, "Labor me, sleep softly." Now the words themselves are half sense, half pure sound. Syllables designed not to be understood, but to be felt. That particular vibration in the chest of a singing mother that a newborn recognizes before it can recognize anything else. The historian Nicholas Orme found approximately 22 surviving medieval English lyrics of this type, lullaby-shaped songs written in the voice of a mother to a child, each one in its own way a testimony. These songs existed because children needed to sleep and because parents needed to sing. The orecchio is a device I want to tell you about because I think it is one of the most quietly human inventions in all of medieval history. Developed in Italy, probably in the 15th century though, possibly earlier, It was a simple wooden apparatus designed to allow a mother or nurse to share a bed with an infant safely. A curved wooden frame positioned in the bed between the adult and the child, creating a barrier that prevented rolling. It had the historical descriptions note a special opening position to allow nursing without needing to remove the barrier. Someone sat down and thought through this problem, thought through the specific geometry of a sleeping body and a small infant, designed a solution that was both practical and in its way tender. An entire object invented, crafted, placed into a bed for the sole purpose of keeping a child safe in the dark. The Renaissance later took this concept more seriously. The fear of overlying the grief of parents who had lost infants in the night drove real efforts at design and prevention. But the Arucchio is a medieval invention, and it tells you something about what medieval parents were willing to do to protect their children from the dangers of sleep. Something else lived in the medieval nursery that I want to mention, because I think it illuminates the whole texture of medieval childhood in a way that facts and figures cannot quite manage. The swaddling cloth. Medieval infants were wrapped almost from the moment of birth in tight bands of cloth that bound their limbs closely against their bodies. The practice was not cruelty, it was in the medical understanding of the time essential protection. Medieval physicians believed that a baby's bones were still soft like wax, still forming, that the limbs, if left to move freely, might grow crooked or fail to develop properly. The swaddling cloth held the body in the correct position while the bones hardened into their intended shape, unwrapped only for bathing in warm water with herbs in the water for comfort and to ward off illness. The infant spent its early weeks and months bound, rocking in its cradle, sleeping in the constrained warmth of those cloth bands. And then the 14th century German physician Bartholomeus Sharon Miller wrote a text for wet nurses that includes this remarkable detail. What should a nurse do if she cannot get the child off wine? If she cannot get the child off wine. Medieval infants were sometimes given diluted wine, white wine mixed with water as a kind of mild sedative. The answer, incidentally, was give it less wine and more diluted. I offer this information without comment other than to say, parents have always been doing their best with what they had. What strikes me when I hold all of this together, the cradle and the Arucchio and the lullaby and the swaddling cloth and the 1-in-4 mortality rate, is not the sadness of it. Or not only the sadness, what strikes me as the persistence. Medieval parents buried children, many of them more than once, and then they had more children, and they built cradles and hired cradle rockers and invented wooden safety barriers and sang lullabies in the dark that were half prayer and half grief, and half pure stubborn insistence that this small person would live. The lullaby is in some ways the most concentrated act of hope in all of human history. You are singing to someone who cannot yet understand words. You are singing to quiet them, yes, but you are also singing because to sing at all in the face of everything you know about the fragility of this tiny breathing thing beside you. That is an act of faith so ordinary that it barely registers. And yet, every parent in history has done it. La sleeps softly. Now the medieval nursery, for all its dangers, was also full of sound, of the rocking of the cradle, of the low singing of a tired mother, of the small indignant cries of a person who has recently arrived in the world and is not entirely pleased with the arrangements. And under all of it, the quiet of the house settling into the night, the fire burning lower, the animals shifting in the darkness outside, and somewhere in that great collective human sleep, restless, fragile, imperfect, courageous, the smallest participants of all, the ones who had just arrived, and the ones trying with everything they had to keep them here. That persistence, that refusal to let grief be the final word, is something we will see again in a very different setting. Because if the nursery shows us sleep at its most tender, then the world we're about to enter shows it at its most dangerous. Not for the young or the fragile, for the powerful. For the ones who commanded armies and shaped kingdoms. For the men and women who thought that rank and wealth and walls of stone might offer them something the peasant's child and the merchant's infant could never have. Safety in the dark. They were wrong. And how they were wrong and what it cost them is one of the most fascinating corners of medieval history that almost no one talks about. Power in the Middle Ages was almost entirely physical. It was not a concept, not an institution, not a set of laws that continued to function independently of the person who held authority. Power was a body, a specific human body in a specific room, drawing breath, making decisions capable of being removed by anyone willing and able to get close enough to do it. And once a night, every night, that body had to sleep. This is something that the grandeur of medieval history tends to quietly paper over. We study the campaigns, the treaties, the coronations, the pronouncements. We read about kings and emperors as though they were figures of pure will and strategy, operating somewhere above the ordinary mechanics of human vulnerability. But every one of them every night laid down their head, and every one of them in those hours became something they were not during the day: helpless. Let me tell you about a study that I find quietly extraordinary. Professor Manuel Eisner, a criminologist at the University of Cambridge, spent years analyzing the deaths of 1,513 European monarchs across 45 different dynasties, covering the period from the year 600 1800. His finding when it came was stark. In the early medieval period, roughly from the 7th through the 10th centuries, approximately 1 in every 4 European rulers was killed by someone else. Not in battle, not in tournament, murdered by family members, by trusted advisors, by the people who slept nearest to them. 1 in 4. And the most common method of assassination, not armies, not public executions, not dramatic confrontations. The most common scenario was intimate, personal, nocturnal. Someone who had access to the king's private quarters. Someone in many cases who had the access specifically because they were trusted. The medieval royal bedchamber was paradoxically one of the most public places in a palace. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but understand how the medieval court worked. The king's proximity was the king's gift to be allowed into the private chambers to sleep near the king, to attend him in the morning, to be present when he was dressed or when he ate in private. This was not a burden. This was power. This was influence. This was the most valuable commodity in a medieval court. There were elaborate hierarchies built around it. The Lord Chamberlain controlled access to the outer rooms. Deeper in the gentlemen of the bedchamber, typically noblemen of significant rank were permitted to attend the king in his most private spaces. And at the very center of this system in the English royal household was a position with one of the most straightforwardly named job descriptions in all of history: the groom of the stool. The groom of the stool attended the king in his most intimate moments, including the use of the royal close stool, which is exactly what you are thinking it is. And this person, whose duties began in the most undignified service imaginable, was because of the access it granted one of the most powerful figures in the entire royal household. That proximity to the monarch, even in vulnerability, even in the moments when the king was most completely human and least ceremonially regal, that proximity translated directly into political power. It gave the groom of the stool the ear of the king, and the ear of the king was in medieval politics everything. But here is the other side of that intimacy. The same access that made the gentleman of the bedchamber powerful also made the king vulnerable, because the people closest to a sleeping king were of necessity the people best positioned to harm him. And the history of medieval Europe is salted throughout with stories of exactly that. The Byzantine Emperor Nephoros II was one of the most capable military commanders of his era. He had recaptured territory from Arab forces, revived the Eastern Roman Empire's strength, and secured the empire's borders through sheer relentless competence. He was also, by most accounts, cold, abrasive, and politically isolated. His empress, Theophano, had grown to despise him, and his chief general, John Zimisces, had grown to want something other than his role as a subordinate. On the night of December the 10th, in the year 969, Nicephorus retired to his bedchamber in the palace at Constantinople. The conspirators had already been smuggled inside. They had hidden throughout the day. They attacked him as he slept. The historian Leo the Deacon, who recorded these events, describes the scene with the kind of blunt specificity that medieval chroniclers sometimes had. The emperor was awakened, propped himself on his elbow, and one of the attackers struck him with a sword, hitting his brow and eyelid, crushing the bone. Niceros cried out in what Leo records as a very loud voice, "Help me, O Mother of God!" He was found there the next morning. John Zamiskis was crowned emperor, agreed to do penance for murder, and separated himself from his lover. Which means that in the medieval imperial accounting of such things, the penance squared the moral debt and the murder was profitable. The story of King James I of Scotland is one I keep returning to because it contains a detail so specific, so human, so completely absurd in the tragic way that history sometimes is, that I cannot read it without feeling something catch in my chest. James. I was, by the standards of the era, a remarkable man. He had spent 18 years as a prisoner of the English from the age of 12, captured at sea, held until a ransom was paid. And during those years, he'd educated himself, written poetry, and developed the kind of considered, deliberate character that captivity sometimes produces. When he finally returned to Scotland in 1424, he was 42 years old and determined. He made enemies quickly. On the evening of February the 20th, 1437, James was at the Blackfriars' monastery in Perth. He was in his nightgown and slippers, standing by the fire, playing and talking with his Queen Joan and her ladies. The evening had the quality of ease chess, perhaps, or cards, or simply conversation in the warmth. Outside, approximately 30 armed men were moving quietly through the monastery grounds. Among them was the man who let them in, Robert Stewart, the king's own chamberlain, the very person responsible for the security of the royal chambers. He had done something simple and unforgivable in preparation. He had removed the bolt from the door. When the noise of armored men reached the chamber, James understood immediately. He tested the windows, leaded and fixed they would not break. He took iron tongs from the fireplace, wrenched up a section of the wooden floor, and dropped into the space below. A vault, a cellar, the drain of the privy. And there he hid in the dark, in the cold, in the filth, listening to the footsteps overhead as 30 men searched for him. They searched for a long time, long enough that James, in the silence that eventually fell, concluded they had given up and gone. He called out to the women above him. He asked them to come with sheets and lift him from the privy. He was wrong. One of the conspirators had realized what the only possible hiding place must be. James, the first king of Scots, was pulled from the drain of the privy by his assassins and killed with 16 stab wounds. He was 42 years old. And now here is the detail I mentioned. The reason James could not escape through the drain, the reason the particular exit was blocked, is that he had ordered it stopped up himself only a few days before. He had been losing tennis balls down it. The escape route that might have saved his life had been sealed shut because of a tennis ball problem. There is a woman in this story whose name I want to say aloud because history does not say it often enough. Catherine Douglas. She was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Joan. She was young. She had no weapon. She had no authority that mattered in that moment. When the conspirators forced their way toward the chamber door, when it became clear the door had been unlocked from the inside and would not hold, Catherine Douglas did something that has no rational explanation other than simple courage. She slid her own arm through the iron staples of the door in place of the missing bolt and held it there. As the men on the other side pushed, they broke her arm. They came through anyway, and the king she was trying to protect still died. But she tried. A woman with an arm for a bolt. History gave her a name for it afterward. Cape Barras, the measures medieval kings took to protect themselves in sleep or when you read them carefully. A kind of record of everything they understood about their own vulnerability. They built concentric layers of access. Outer chamber, inner chamber, privy chamber, each requiring specific permission to enter. They slept in castles with thick stone walls, not primarily for the drama of it, but because stone walls reduced the number of possible entry points to a controllable few. They kept armed guards posted outside their bedchamber doors through the night. In some traditions, a trusted servant or even a noble companion slept in the same room, not for warmth or company, but as an additional layer of protection. And yet the chamberlain could remove the bolt. The trusted general could smuggle conspirators into the palace. The groom of the bedchamber, sleeping nearest of all, could be the one who planned what happened in the dark. Power in the medieval understanding could never be fully protected. Not because the walls were not thick enough or the guards not numerous enough, but because trust was the irreducible minimum of governance, and trust by its nature could always be betrayed. There is a dimension of this that goes beyond the dramatic stories of assassination, because even without the knife or the sword, medieval kings were vulnerable in their sleep in ways they could not fully counter. A Cambridge University study found that in the early medieval period, when formal legal systems were still developing, the murder rate among European monarchs was roughly 1 in 4. But as legal systems strengthened, as the murder of a monarch became not just risky, but theologically and legally catastrophic in ways that rippled outward, the rate declined significantly. By the 16th century, it had become, as Professor Eisner noted, quite uncommon to organize a transfer of power through murder. Not because human nature had changed, but because the institutional structures around the sleeping king had gradually become stronger than any individual's ambition to act against them. The walls that eventually protected medieval rulers from assassination in their beds were not made of stone. They were made of law, of shared belief, of the slow, difficult, imperfect work of building systems that survived any individual betrayal. The stone walls were theater. The real protection was something that had to be built over centuries. Something about this strikes me as genuinely worth sitting with, especially at night when it is easy to feel either very safe or very uncertain about the world outside. The medieval king who laid down in his curtained bed each night surrounded by guards, insulated by layers of ritual and hierarchy in stone, was in some ways less protected than the modern person in an ordinary house with a deadbolt and a functioning legal system. Not because violence was more common then, though it was, but because the systems that make safety possible, trust between people, rule of law, the expectation that violence has consequences, those systems were still being built. Every medieval night, they were still being assembled by people who did not entirely know what they were building, and who paid sometimes in the most intimate possible way when the assembly failed. There is one more king I want to tell you about, not because his story involves drama or assassination, but because of the image it leaves behind. Henry III of England, who ruled through much of the 13th century, was not murdered. He died of natural causes in his bed in the year 1272 after a reign of 56 years, one of the longest in English history. But during his reign, he was known for something that the medieval chroniclers recorded with a mixture of reverence and gentle mockery. He went to Mass every day, not once, sometimes 2 or 3 times, and he slept according to accounts with the kind of deliberate preparation that spoke of a man who understood every night what sleep actually cost a king. He had advisors. He had enemies. He had sons who would eventually challenge his authority, and every night he laid down his head in a kingdom that might or might not be his in the morning. He was in that sense no different from the peasant farmer on the other side of England, who also laid down in the dark, knowing only imperfectly what morning would bring. Power did not exempt you from the fundamental human condition. It only made the stakes more visible, and the darkness for a king was the same darkness as for anyone, just more populated. As we move through this long night together, we're approaching territory that exists somewhere between the waking world and sleep, a place that medieval people took more seriously than almost anything else in the life of the mind. Because the king who was afraid of the dark had his guards and his walls and his chamberlains, but no king and no peasant and no monk and no mother rocking her cradle. No one could place a guard at the border of the dreaming mind. And in the medieval world, what came through that border was not random noise. It was believed to be a message from somewhere, from something. And the interpretation of that message could change the course of a kingdom. What do you do with a dream? Not a question you probably ask yourself very often. Most mornings, the dream is already dissolving by the time the alarm goes off. A half image, a feeling that fades before you can fully name it, gone by the time you find your shoes. We live in an age that largely does not know what to do with dreams. We have Freudian interpretations. We have neuroscience. We have the understanding that sleep involves memory consolidation, emotional processing, the brain rehearsing patterns from the day. Dreams in the modern framework are meaningful in a general sense, but they are personal, internal, about your anxieties, your wishes, your unresolved conflicts. They are data from inside the self. The medieval world had an entirely different framework. And the difference is not small. To the medieval mind, a dream was not primarily about you. It was primarily about what was trying to reach you. Let me take you back to the 5th century. Not the Middle Ages proper, but the bridge that made medieval dream theory possible. A Roman grammarian and philosopher named Macrobius wrote a commentary on a much older Latin text, Cicero's Dream of Scipio, and in the process he produced something that would shape how educated Europeans thought about dreams for the next 1,000 years. Macrobius classified dreams into 5 categories. 5 categories, not a vague spectrum, a proper taxonomy with Latin names and specific diagnostic criteria. The first was the insomnium, the troubled dream, the nightmare caused by anxiety, by physical discomfort, by what you had eaten before bed. Meaningless. Do not interpret it. The dream of a hungry man who sees food is not prophecy, it is hunger. The second was the Weissman apparition seen in that half-state just before sleep, also not prophetic. Also, ignore these first 2 categories are essentially Macrobius saying, not everything in your sleeping mind is significant. Some of it is just noise. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th categories are where things get interesting. Theulum was the dream in which an authority figure appeared, a parent, a revered person, a priest, or a god, and clearly told you what would or would not happen and what you should or should not do. The Vio was a straightforward prophetic vision. You dreamed something, and then it happened just as you dreamed it. And the somnium, the most complex and the most interesting, was the enigmatic dream. The one that concealed its meaning in symbols, the one that required interpretation, the one that was not giving you its message directly, but through a veil of strange images. Now, Macrobius wrote in the 5th century, but his framework was not simply a historical curiosity that the medieval world preserved out of reverence for the classics. It was actively used. Chaucer knew it. He cited Macrobius by name in his Parliament of Fowls and used the Macrobian categories as the intellectual scaffolding for his own dream poetry. Dante knew it. Boccaccio knew it. William Langland, who wrote Piers Plowman, knew it. The framework was alive, argued over, refined, and applied to real situations by real people making real decisions. Because here's what the medieval world understood that we have mostly lost the vocabulary to even discuss. If a dream could be an oraculum, if God or a saint or a departed parent could actually appear in your sleep and give you genuine instruction, then paying attention to your dreams was not superstition. It was prudence. It was the same rational behavior as paying attention to any other reliable source of information. The question was only, and this was not a small question, how you distinguished the meaningful dream from the meaningless one. How you knew whether last night's vision was God or indigestion. This is where the dream books came in. The most famous and widely circulated dream manual of the Middle Ages was a text known as the Somniella Danielis, the Dreams of Daniel. It was not actually written by the prophet Daniel, though it was dedicated to him, and the attribution to a biblical figure with famous prophetic credentials was obviously intentional. It drew its authority from the same well as the Book of Daniel itself. The idea that some people were granted special insight into the meaning of hidden things. The Somni Danielis was structured as an alphabetical glossary. You dreamed of a specific thing, say water or teeth or fire or a strange animal, and you found that entry in the glossary and the book told you what it meant. Water in various forms might predict different outcomes depending on whether it was clear or muddy flowing or still. Dreaming of teeth falling out, which remains one of the most commonly reported dreams in the world today across every culture, had specific medieval interpretations that varied by which tooth, under what circumstances, in what part of the dream occurred. The manuscripts were sometimes color-coded, the dream subject written in red. The interpretation in black, which gives you, I think, an interesting image of a medieval household with access to such a manuscript, someone sitting by candlelight the morning after an unsettling night, running their finger down a page of red and black lettering, trying to find the shape of what they had seen in their sleep, seeking to understand what the night had been trying to tell them. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. Historians believe that thousands of unique versions of the Somnia Danielis once existed across Europe, translated into French, Italian, German, English, Spanish, Portuguese, and more. Different versions for different regions reflecting different local concerns and different cultural anxieties. Most are lost, but scholars have found hundreds of surviving manuscript copies. 88 versions of a related text, the Somni Isef, survive. The Somni Danielis itself circulated widely from at least the 9th century through the 16th. These were not rare scholarly texts locked away in monastery libraries. They were household books, the medieval equivalent of something you keep on the bedside table, the bestellers of the sleeping world. When historians study what was included in dream books from different regions and periods, they read it as a kind of mirror into the anxieties and concerns of ordinary people. What did they fear? What did they hope for? What did they dream about year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation? The dream books are in a strange and tender way one of the most intimate archives of the medieval inner life that we have. But the theoretical architecture of medieval dream interpretation was not built only by Macrobius. There was also Hildegard of Bingen. She lived from around 1098 to 1179, a Benedictine abbess in the Rhineland. One of the most remarkable minds of her century and one of the very few medieval women whose written work survived in abundance. Hildegard was a composer, a poet, an herbalist, a theologian, and the author of 2 significant medical texts, Causae Edurae and Physica. And in those medical writings, she addressed sleep and dreams with a precision that was unusual for her era. She understood sleep, she wrote, as both a passive and an active process. Not simply the body at rest, but the body engaged in something necessary and complex. She warned against sleeping too little and against sleeping too much. She described what we would now recognize as categories of insomnia, identified potential causes, and suggested treatments. But it is her account of her own visions that makes Hildegard something genuinely singular in the history of the medieval dreaming mind. From early childhood, she experienced what she called the living light, a luminous visual phenomenon that accompanied her most significant visions. In her 40s, she began under instruction. She understood as divine to write them down. The result was Civius Know the Ways. 26 visions recorded and illustrated describing creation, redemption, and the future of the Church. Pope Eugenius III read the first parts of in the year 1147 and declared Hildegard's prophetic writings authentic. The most powerful religious institution on earth had officially endorsed a 12th century German abbess's account of her visionary sleep. What followed was extraordinary. Hildegard became a figure of genuine political and spiritual authority. Emperors and popes wrote to her. She preached public sermons which women were not supposed to do. And no one stopped her because the content of her visions was so specific and so compelling that the Church found it more expedient to accept them than to dismiss them. Modern neurologists looking at Hildegard's descriptions of her visions, the showers of light, the wavy lines, the intense pain that accompanied them, have suggested carefully but persistently that she may have experienced severe migraines with visual aura. The living light that Hildegard understood as God may have been in physiological terms the visual disturbance of a neurological event. And here is where I always stop and sit with a question, because I think it is genuinely important. Does that explanation diminish what she saw? If the mechanism was neurological and the experience was divine, if the human brain overwhelmed by a migraine opened onto something that Hildegard genuinely believed and genuinely communicated, and genuinely changed the world, through which account of the truth is more complete? I do not have an answer. I just think the question deserves more attention than we usually give it. Then there is Joan. If Hildegard represents the most sanctioned and celebrated version of the medieval prophetic dream, carefully documented, officially endorsed, institutionally powerful, then Joan of Arc represents its most dangerous edge. She was born in 1412 in a small village in northeastern France. From the age of 13, she reported hearing voices and seeing figures specifically. She identified them as Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, who instructed her with increasing specificity and urgency. The voices told her that France would be saved, that she would lead an army, that a specific town would be relieved of a siege, and she was right. At 17, she persuaded a regional commander to give her an audience with the heir to the French throne. At 18, she was leading troops. At 19, following a French military reversal at the siege of Compiègne, she was captured. The trial that followed in Rouen in 1431 was, among other things, a prosecution of her dreams. The voices she described were subjected to detailed theological interrogation. Were they genuine? Were they diabolical? Was the content consistent with what a genuine saint would say? Had she done the appropriate things to verify their authenticity? The court found after months of hearings that her visions were not genuine divine communication. She was 19 years old when she was burned. 25 years later, a retrial declared the original verdict invalid. The charges were overturned. 6 centuries later, in 920, she was canonized. The same institution that burned her for her dreams eventually made her a saint for them. I want to tell you about one more dimension of medieval dream culture that most people are entirely unaware of. A practical, social, everyday dimension that existed far below the level of saints and abbesses and theological tribunals. The belief common and widespread and entirely sincere that the dead could visit the living in dreams. Not as a metaphor, not as a projection of grief, as a literal event. In medieval understanding, the soul of a person recently deceased might appear in the dreams of those who loved them, or those who had wronged them with messages, with requests, with instructions, with warnings. These visitations were taken seriously enough to generate practical guidelines. If a deceased relative appeared in your dream requesting prayers, masses said for their soul, alms giving particular acts of piety, you were expected to fulfill those requests. The dream was a channel of communication between the living and the dead, and a neglected request was a spiritual obligation left unfulfilled. This belief shows up in the miracle stories, in the legal records, in the devotional literature, in the personal letters that survive from the medieval period. A parent appears to a child and asks that a debt be repaid. A spouse appears to a widow and reveals where something was hidden. A stranger appears and asks simply to be remembered. These were not dismissed as fantasy. They were treated as the same category of communication as a letter delivered by messenger. Something arrived in the night from somewhere. You were responsible for how you received it. Here's what I find myself returning to when I think about all of this at length. Modern neuroscience has confirmed with considerable precision that the dreaming brain is doing something real. REM sleep involves the activation of the limbic system, the brain's emotional center. It involves the processing of memory, the integration of experience, the consolidation of learning. Researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, found that the neurochemistry of REM sleep creates a kind of safe environment in which the brain can reprocess emotionally charged memories, reducing their distress, extracting meaning, filing experience into larger patterns of understanding. The medieval person who woke at 2 o'clock in the morning during their second sleep sat in the quiet dark and turned their dream over in their mind, carefully asking what it meant. What it was trying to say was, without knowing any of the neuroscience, engaged in exactly the kind of conscious processing that sleep researchers now believe is essential to emotional health. The dream book was in its way a prompt for reflection. The belief that dreams carried meaning was in its functional effect an invitation to take your inner life seriously, to not dismiss what arrived in the night, to sit with it, to ask the question that modern life has largely decided is not worth asking. What was that? What was it trying to tell me? What do I actually know from the inside that I have not had time to hear during the hours when the world was loud and moving? Medieval people did not have better answers to that question than we do, but they had more practice asking it. And there is something about that, about the willingness to sit in the dark, in the quiet, and take the sleeping mind seriously, that I think we have lost at some cost to ourselves. We're almost at the end of this long, extraordinary night. We've moved through straw beds and rope frames, through demons and candles, and prayers said in darkness, through plague and lullabies and the fears of kings. And now there is one question left. The one that has been hovering over every story, every detail, every sleeper we have visited tonight. What does all of this mean for us? Not as history, not as interesting facts about people who are long gone, as an inheritance, as something that the 1,000 years of medieval night still has to say to the person lying awake right now in whatever kind of bed, in whatever kind of room, with whatever kind of quiet or noise around them. And that is where we are going next, to the place where everything we have learned tonight comes together. Not into answers exactly, but into something that might if you let it feel like rest. We've traveled a long way tonight, through straw mattresses and rope frames, through the classified dreams of Macrobius, and the lullabies that were really laments through plague and candles, and the prayers of monks who woke at 2 o'clock in the morning because they believed the darkness was worth sanctifying, through a king hiding in a sewer because of a tennis ball, through a young woman who used her arm as a bolt, through all of the ordinary, extraordinary, terrifying, tender ways that human beings have tried to do this one fundamental thing, sleep. And now we're here at the end of the night, the place where I always find myself a little reluctant to arrive because this is the question I've been building toward for hours, and I know it does not have a clean answer. So here it is. After everything we have seen, the straw, the ropes, the demons, the dreams, the plague, the lullabies, does any of it change how you understand your own nights? Let me tell you something that I find genuinely remarkable. Sleep researchers, beginning in the 1980s and accelerating through the 90s and beyond, started to notice a strange pattern. When people were placed in conditions of total darkness, full nights of 14 to 16 hours, the way winter nights would have been before artificial light, their sleep did something unexpected. It split. They slept for several hours. Then they woke naturally without alarm for an hour or two. Then they slept again until morning. The historian Roger Akersh had documented thousands of references to this pattern in medieval and early modern texts. The French physician Laurent Joubert, writing in the 16th century, had described manual laborers making love after the first sleep because they had more enjoyment and do it better in that interval. The Old English ballad of Robin of Portelet had included the lines, "At the wakening of your first sleep, you shall have a hot drink made." Robert Louis Stevenson called the interval between the two sleeps a nightly resurrection. Francis Bacon called it the time between sleeps. And when Thomas Ware, a psychiatrist at the National Institute of Mental Health, ran his darkness experiments in 1992, something else appeared in that quiet hour between first and second sleep. Something that the prolactin levels in participants' blood suggested was genuinely distinctive. The body in that interval was in chemical terms in a state that V described as similar to what you might feel after a day at the spa. Low cortisol, elevated prolactin, a deep meditative calm, not insomnia, not wakefulness as failure, an old inheritance, a reminder arriving in the body that the human night was never designed to be 8 uninterrupted hours of managed unconsciousness. It was designed to have a pause in the middle, a quiet space, a nightly intermission. And here's what I think about when I sit with this finding. Every person who has ever woken at 2 o'clock in the morning, heart slightly racing, mind turning over some unresolved thing, and felt a wash of anxiety at the thought of lying there awake. Every single one of those people was experiencing something ancient, something the medieval world had a name for, something they simply did not treat as a problem. Because when there is no electric clock glowing red on the nightstand number 347, demanding to be read and evaluated, the waking mind at midnight does not experience its own activity as failure. It experiences it as the night. Akersh documented what medieval people did in those hours, between first and second sleep, and the list reads like a window into a different relationship with consciousness. They prayed sitting up in the dark or kneeling or whispering into the room. They thought carefully about their dreams, the ones that had come in the first sleep, which were, literary scholar Claude Fretz later argued, more powerful phenomena than our modern experience of dreaming might lead us to believe precisely because they were reviewed in that calm interval rather than forgotten by dawn. They talked to whoever was beside them, and remember someone was almost always beside them. A spouse, a sibling, a servant, a traveling stranger at an inn. The middle-of-the-night conversation conducted in darkness and low voices may have been one of the most intimate forms of human communication in the entire medieval world. They made love. Joubert noted this specifically, and there is something in his matter-of-fact recording of it, Not scandalous, not secretive, simply a thing that happened in the quiet hours that speaks to a relationship with the nighttime body that is almost entirely lost to us. And some of them, the ones with grain stores and animals to check, Rose did a small amount of practical work by candle or firelight and returned to bed not reluctantly as part of the rhythm. I want to tell you something about Inez because I think the medieval inn holds a kind of lesson that we've almost entirely stopped being able to hear. When a traveler arrived at a medieval inn along one of the great roads of England or France, Canterbury, or the pilgrimage routes to Rome, or the trading roads between the market towns of Germany, they did not expect a private room. They expected a bed which they would share with whoever else had arrived that day, a stranger in many cases, someone whose name they might learn or might not, someone who smelled of the road and the animals they traveled with, someone whose breathing would fill the dark room alongside their own for the hours until dawn. And the etiquette for this which actually existed, which travelers understood and generally followed, was simply lie still, don't hog the blankets, keep to your half. That is the entire rule book. Do not disturb. And within that minimal framework of courtesy, something genuinely human happened. People talked in the dark before sleep took them. They shared information news from the road conditions ahead, gossip from distant towns. They made the darkness a little less lonely for each other. In the poorest establishments, the sleeping arrangement was even more radical. A long wooden bench, a rope strung horizontally at chest height. Travelers would sit on the bench, lean forward, drape their arms over the rope, and sleep upright. In the morning, the innkeeper would cut the rope, everyone would tumble forward, and the day would begin. This was called, in some accounts, the two-penny upright, because you paid 2 pennies for the rope. And yes, I know that sounds absolutely awful. But somewhere in that image, that row of exhausted travelers hanging from a rope in the dark, breathing together, none of them alone in the night, there is something that the modern person in their perfectly climate-controlled room with their perfect firm mattress and their sleep tracking device on their wrist is quietly missing. The simple, ancient comfort of not being the only one awake. Here is one more thing I want to leave you with. The Victorians ended communal sleeping, not all at once and not through any single declaration, but gradually through the widening of middle-class prosperity, through the multiplication of rooms in houses, through a growing conviction that privacy was not just desirable but morally significant. The practice of sharing beds with people outside the immediate family became associated with poverty, then with impropriety, then with something approaching shame. By the end of the 19th century, the private bedroom was not just a luxury, it was an expectation, a right, an indicator of moral order. The bed, which had for centuries been a place of community, where families gathered, where guests were welcomed, where strangers briefly shared the warmth and weight of human proximity, became a sealed unit, one person or at most two behind a closed door. And we call this progress. And in many ways, it is. Privacy is real. The ability to have a space that is genuinely yours, undisturbed, unshared quiet, is a genuine human good. But I have come to think somewhere in this long inquiry into medieval nights that we may have taken something away without fully understanding what it was. The medieval sleeper lying in their shared darkness, surrounded by the breathing of others, was never entirely alone in the night. The fears were real. The discomfort was real. The fleas were genuinely 100% thoroughly real. But the loneliness, that particular modern loneliness of lying awake at 3 o'clock in the morning with only your own thoughts for company, convinced that everyone else is sleeping soundly, certain that your own wakefulness is a failure, that loneliness was not part of the arrangement, because the person beside you was also sometimes awake, and the person beside them, and the monk in the chapel down the road was awake deliberately by choice, filling the darkness with something he believed was worth the cold and the effort. The medieval night was full, not comfortable, not safe, not free from grief or fear or the unpredictable cruelty of illness and history, but full. Can I ask you something right now? In whatever bed or room or couch or floor you are in, what does the night feel like to you? Not as a concept, not in the abstract. What does it actually feel like right now to be a person lying down in the dark? I ask because I think that question has been slowly draining from modern life, and I think it is worth recovering. The medieval person could not ask it. The darkness was too complete, the night too present for the question to disappear. They had to negotiate with the night, had to develop a relationship with it, had to find within it something that could sustain them through the hours until morning. Prayer, company, dream. The fire tended and the animals checked, and the quiet conversation in the dark with whoever was near enough to hear. These were not primitive coping mechanisms. They were sophisticated responses to a genuine human need. The need to not be alone in the dark. The need to believe that something is watching over the night. The need to feel that the vulnerability of sleep, the radical, total, unavoidable vulnerability of unconsciousness is held within something larger than yourself. We have replaced those things with technology and with medication and with the very reasonable, very modern belief that we can engineer good sleep if we just get the conditions right. And sometimes we can. And sometimes at 3 o'clock in the morning staring at the ceiling, we cannot. And in those moments, and I genuinely mean this, think of the medieval sleeper, not with condescension, not with the comfortable distance of looking back at the ignorant past, with recognition. They were lying in the dark, too. They were awake when they would rather have slept. They were afraid of things they could not name, and missing people they could not have back, and uncertain about what the morning would bring. And they found ways to be in it, to not fight the night, but to inhabit it, to let it be what it was. Tonight, after everything we've explored together, I want to offer you one last thought. Sleep for the medieval world was never primarily about performance. There was no tracking of sleep stages, no optimization of sleep hygiene, no anxiety about whether your REM cycles were adequate or your deep sleep percentage was where it should be. Sleep was simply what happened when you let the night take you. You said your prayer, whatever form that took for you. You lay down in whatever your bed was. You let the darkness arrive and you trusted. Not perfectly, not without fear, not without the awareness of everything that could go wrong in the night. But you trusted anyway because there was no other way to do it. Because the morning always came, not for everyone, not every time, but reliably enough. And the person who had slept on straw in a smoky room with the pig nearby in an uncertain world outside that person woke up and fed the fire and began another day with no certificate of achievement, no sleep score, just the quiet fact of having made it through the night, which, when you think about it, is the same quiet fact you are working toward right now. So let the blanket settle, let the breath slow, let the sounds of the room become the sounds of the room. Just sounds, not threats, not problems, just the house breathing around you the way houses do. If you wake at 2 or 3 or 4 and find yourself in that strange quiet alertness, that old familiar middle of the night, then lie there. You do not have to solve anything in those hours. You do not have to make the wakefulness mean something. You can simply be awake the way the medieval world was awake in the pause between two sleeps, and then let the second sleep find you the way it always has, the way it always will. Thank you for spending this night with me. For every single person listening, whether you're on a memory foam mattress in a suburb in Ohio or a modest bed in a London flat or a sleeping bag on a floor somewhere entirely unexpected, you are part of a human tradition of lying down in the dark that stretches back beyond written history. Before the rope beds, before the straw pallets, before the first candle was lit against the first medieval night, human beings have always needed to sleep, and they have always found a way. You're in very good company tonight. Rest now. Something happened in a laboratory in the early 1990s that I think deserves far more attention than it has ever received. Thomas Vare, a psychiatrist at the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States, ran a quiet, methodical experiment. He took a group of healthy volunteers and placed them in a controlled environment with one deliberate adjustment to their world. He gave them 14 hours of darkness every night. No artificial light, no screens, no reading lamp or television glow or the pale blue light of a phone charging on a nightstand. Just darkness, the kind of long, full darkness that every human being on the planet experienced every winter night before the 19th century changed everything. And then he watched what their bodies did. For the first few nights, they slept long and deep, 11, 12 hours, as though repaying a debt they had not known they were carrying. But by the fourth week, something shifted. Their bodies settled into a different pattern entirely. They would fall asleep, sleep for 3 to 5 hours, then wake naturally without distress for 1 to 2 hours of quiet alertness, then fall back to sleep for another 3 to 5 hours until morning. Ware measured their hormone levels during that middle waking period, and what he found was remarkable. The participants were producing elevated prolactin, the same hormone the body releases during deep meditation during moments of genuine calm. Their cortisol was low, their minds were clear and still. Veer described the state as an altered state of consciousness, not unlike meditation, not insomnia, not failure, something ancient, something the body, given the chance, simply remembered. Now I want you to think about what that means. Because what V had inadvertently reproduced in a controlled modern laboratory with health monitoring equipment and careful scientific documentation was the medieval night. He had given those participants the same darkness that every person sleeping on straw in 14th century England lived inside, and their bodies had done exactly what the medieval body did. They woke in the middle of the night. They sat in the quiet and then they slept again. The first sleep and the second sleep dismissed from Western consciousness when gas lamps lit the streets of European cities in the early 1800s. Forgotten entirely. Once Thomas Edison's electric light made darkness a choice rather than a condition had not gone anywhere. They had just been waiting, suppressed by artificial light, by alarm clocks, by the Industrial Revolution's demand for a consistent and consolidated working day, by the modern conviction that 8 uninterrupted hours is the correct and natural shape of the human night. But the body had not forgotten. It never does. Here is something that I have thought about many times while preparing this story, and I want to share it with you now carefully because I do not want to romanticize what was genuinely hard. The medieval person who woke at midnight was not waking into comfort. They were waking into a cold room, possibly into darkness without a single source of light unless the fire had been kept alive, into a world without running water, without plumbing, without the gentle hum of a refrigerator or the reassurance of a neighbor's window still lit 2 streets away. They were waking into the real and present knowledge that rats moved through the walls, that disease had no predictable mercy, that the child sleeping nearby had a 1 in 4 chance of not reaching their F-type birthday. They were waking into genuine uncertainty. And yet, and this is the thing, I keep returning to their relationship with that waking was different from ours because they had a name for it. They knew it was coming. They had things to do in it. They prayed. They talked to whoever was beside them. They thought carefully about their dreams, turning the images over in the quiet in the way that literary scholar Claude Fretz later documented, made those dreams more powerful phenomena than anything we experience because we forget ours by the time we reach for our phones. Some of them got up and checked the fire. Some of them, as the records tell us, with charming matter-of-factness, made love, and then the second sleep came for them, and they went back into it, not as a defeat, as the second half of the night, as the thing that always came next. Mary Cascadon, a sleep researcher at Brown University, one of the most respected figures in modern sleep science, put it plainly when asked about Eckhurt's historical findings alongside V's laboratory results. She said, "Maybe the brain simply cannot keep you asleep for prolonged periods." And she added that what this research highlights is something humanity might have lost in the hurry of modern life. Not a dramatic loss, not a catastrophic one, just a quiet disconnection from something the body still knows underneath all the optimization and the tracking and the increasingly elaborate rituals we build around the hope of a perfect night. David Newbow, a specialist in sleep medicine at Johns Hopkins, has gone further, suggesting that consolidated sleep, the seamless 8-hour block we're all trying to achieve, may be in some fundamental sense an artificial construct. That the demand for uninterrupted sleep is a product of industrial ruling, not biology, not nature, a clock we imposed on ourselves, and some of the insomnia that afflicts roughly 1 in 3 adults in the modern world. Some portion of that suffering, that 3 a.m. wakefulness with its attendant anxiety and shame, maybe the body simply trying to do something it was designed to do, something it has always done, something the medieval world understood well enough to build prayers around it. I want to be careful here because I am not a sleep scientist, and I am not suggesting that everyone who struggles with sleep simply needs to rediscover the first sleep. That would be too simple, and the reality of genuine sleep disorders is too serious to wave away with a history lesson. But I do think there is something real in this, something worth knowing. If you wake in the middle of the night, if the darkness finds you alert and awake when you would rather be unconscious, you are not necessarily broken. You're not necessarily failing at something. You may simply be a human body doing what human bodies have done in the dark for longer than any text can document. The monk was awake at 2 in the morning by design, filling the darkness with prayer. The farmer was awake at midnight, checking the fire and turning his dreams over in his mind. The merchant's wife was awake in the silence of a shared room, and someone nearby was also awake, and they spoke in low voices about something that would not survive the morning. Just a thought, just a moment, just the strange intimacy of being conscious together in the middle of the night. Every single one of them would have found our anxiety about waking up to be genuinely bewildering. They would not have understood why we treat the interrupted night as a malfunction. To them, the interruption was the point. Let me tell you where this leaves me personally, because I think it is only fair after everything we've explored tonight. I came to this subject because I have always been drawn to the texture of ordinary historical life. Not the battles and the coronations, but the human details. What they ate, what they wore, and it turned out how they slept. What I did not expect to find when I started digging into medieval sleep was that I would come out the other side feeling differently about my own nights. But I do. When I wake now in the small hours, that 2 a.m. or 3 o'clock a.m., alertness that used to feel like a failure, I think about Thomas's participants in their 14-hour darkness, their prolactin rising their minds in that quiet, meditative state. I think about the monk in his cold chapel choosing the dark. I think about the family in their one-room cottage lying close together, the fire burning down, someone tending it and returning to bed without making a sound. I think about how full the medieval night was, not with comfort exactly, but with presence, with the simple, deliberate inhabiting of the dark hours. And something in that thought makes the ceiling less threatening, makes the wakefulness less of an emergency, makes the night feel for just a moment like something it used to be before we decided it was a problem to be solved. Just the night, doing what nights do. We've traveled such a long way together in these hours. From the straw pallets on the earthen floor to the embroidered curtains of the great lord's chamber, from the rope beneath the mattress. And now you will never say sleep tight the same way again to the great bed of ware with its carved oak and its visiting princes and its 26 adventurous butchers. From the mayor pressing on the chest in the dark to the dream books with their alphabetical glossaries, the subject written in red, the interpretation in black. From Catherine Douglas with her arm through the iron staple of the door to Hildegard of Bingen watching the living light to Joan hearing her voices. From the lullaby that was also a farewell to the cradle rocker whose entire existence was dedicated to keeping one small person asleep. From the king who moved beds every night out of fear to the monk who woke every night at 2 by choice. From the plague flea in the straw to the sweating sickness that arrived in summer and left without explanation. From the first sleep to the quiet hour in the dark to the second sleep to the morning. Every single person in this story eventually reached the morning. Most mornings, and the ones who did not, the ones the night took without returning, left something behind. The prayers they said, the children they rocked, the names carved into the posts of the great bed of ware. I was here. I lay down in this place. I rested. So here is what I want you to carry out of tonight. Not a lesson exactly, more like a permission. The permission to be a little less at war with your own sleep, to hold the imperfect night a little more gently, to remember that the person lying in the dark before you, all those people across all those centuries on straw and rope and feathers and stone floors, they were not sleeping in optimized conditions. They were not sleeping perfectly, but they were sleeping honestly in whatever the night was with whatever the dark held. And that honesty, that willingness to simply be in the night rather than fight it, may be the oldest and least complicated sleep advice in human history. Let the night have you and trust that the morning will come. It always has. Thank you. That is not a small thing to say, and I mean it in full. Thank you for spending these hours here, for following this story from a straw mattress in a medieval cottage, all the way to a sleep laboratory in the 1990s, and back again to wherever you are right now. If something tonight shifted something small in how you think about rest, about your own nights, about the long human tradition you are part of every time you close your eyes, then this was worth every moment of the research and the writing and the late nights that went into it. And yes, I do see the irony of someone staying up late to research the history of sleep. I am aware. If this story found you, then please let it find someone else too. Share it with a person in your life who lies awake at 3 in the morning, convinced that something is wrong with them. Leave a comment. Tell me where you are in the world as you listen to this, what time it is, what your night looks like. Those comments mean more than you might think. They remind me that this reaches real people in real rooms. And that is the whole point. And if you want to stay in this world a little longer, if you want to keep following history into the quiet corners that the textbooks miss, then come back. Because there are more nights like this one waiting, more stories that live in the in-between hours, more ordinary, extraordinary human lives that deserve to be remembered. The next one is already being prepared. And I genuinely think you're going to want to be here for it. Until then, take care of yourself. Sleep when the night comes and know that somewhere in the long history of this world, 1,000 different people lay down in 1,000 different kinds of darkness, said their version of good night, and trusted the dark with their lives. You're in very, very good company. Rest now.